flight plan under very specific circumstances. So basically, it's a long way of saying that Canada has embraced this general idea that I was talking about of permissionless innovation. To the privacy concerns that we've been discussing, I get it, I do. The trouble with attempting to regulate privacy concerns rather than just engaging in best practices is privacy is an incredibly amorphous concept. It means different things to different people. I value some aspects of my privacy, but I don't value my privacy that much because I recognize that we live in a day and an age of essentially uncontrollable and ubiquitous flows of information. I benefit a lot more from my cost-benefit analysis from myself, again, by using Gmail for my personal email service for 90% of the communications I send. I understand fully that Google is encrypting that communication, and once they get it, they're decrypting it, they're scanning my email, and then they're sending me back ads for things that they think I might want based on my browser history. I get that that's what I'm getting myself into, which has probably led to more than one specious purchase on my part late at night when I'm too tired to know the difference. That having been said, I think it's also important for us to lay out the clear distinction when we're talking about government drones and commercial drones or private drones. A government drone, clearly there are privacy implications of them flying around and spying, especially domestically, on American citizens. I want that constrained as much as humanly possible, but I don't want it to negatively impact the potential revolutionary effect that drones, if properly integrated into the national airspace in this country, could have in creating an entirely new platform for innovation. What the internet did for bits of data between computers linking human minds, drones could potentially do for American airspace. And I would like to leave the rules, as Richard Epstein once put it, as simple as possible for a complex world. Dynamic systems, like the world in which we live, generally respond to the desire for security and privacy. The question is whose desire for security and whose desire for privacy. If you leave these issues essentially to people to decide for themselves, I think you'll see a flourishing of social norms that regulate the way people deal with technologies.
I saw a hand go up in the audience.
So if somebody flies over my house and I'm sunbathing nude, I might want to knock that person out of the sky. And I'm wondering what Canada does about my right to control who flies over my house by stopping it. In the permissionless system, do I have the right to do that? Are the rules that are being contemplated preemptive rules that preclude civil litigation or other forms of self-help? Could you comment on that?
Sure. No, the rules are...
The freedom to engage in self-help just as somebody has the freedom to fly over my house.
Sure, absolutely. To begin, nothing in the rules preempt any sort of private litigation effort. So liability, it's not quite clear yet where exactly that liability is attached. And, as we have all these other emerging technologies, the considerations for who is liable in the event of an accident is even more complex when you consider, well, what happens if maybe my robotic worker in the street falls over and then my autonomous vehicle hits it, and then the autonomous drone in the sky falls out of the sky and hits both of them, and then there's a giant flaming inferno. We don't really have good questions to that, and part of the reason is these are new and they are emerging technologies. I am generally a fan of allowing the court system, the torts, and the common law to deal with these problems as they arrive. To your question of sunbathing nude outside, hey, to each his own, but I would argue that if you are going outside, even on your own private property, to sunbathe nude, your expectation for privacy has diminished slightly because you've gone outside the walls of your residence. It may still be your property, but when you're exposing, your birthday suit for all to see in the sky, then, the question becomes, the major question you're asking, I think, is how much of the sky above your property do you own? And for that, I'm actually going to punt it over to Alan McQuinn because he knows a lot more of the case law in this situation than I do.
It's really complicated. It's really complicated. That's the simple answer. But the case law that is in the states, and anyone on the panel can correct me if I'm wrong, but states are allowed to set property rules generally. There's been a uniform rule that says for airplanes, but not necessarily for drones. In the Cosby case from the 1940s, said basically what happened was it was a Supreme Court case where there was a bunch of chickens in a chicken farm that was right next to an airport. And right when the World War II started, they made that airport into a huge military airport. So planes flew over this poor chicken farmer's house within 83 feet of his house. And they kept flying over, and chickens died. There was like 150 chickens died. They had no peace, so they sued. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, with actually 2 justices down, because one died and one was litigating Nazi war crimes at the time. Fun fact. Decided that at 83 feet, they awarded $2,000 to the chicken farmer for the damages and the distress from the airplanes that flew over. So there is precedence for up to a certain space, which is, I believe, the tallest point of your domicile or the highest tree, or 83 feet.
I would say the question Cosby answers is, do you have property rights in the airspace with respect to trespasses? And the court in the 40s said, yes, you do, at 83 feet. Mm-hmm. And then later, there was a different question that was asked in the 1980s with a pair of cases involving government plane overflights and government helicopter overflights. And that question was, is there a Fourth Amendment right against the government taking pictures of your property or having human visual observation of your property from higher altitudes? And the court in those cases basically said not above 1,000, not if the plane is above 1,000 feet as of 1980, and not if the helicopter is basically at roughly 500 feet. Although that case is particularly interesting. The helicopter case was particularly interesting because it was sort of circular. They relied on the fact that at the time the FAA was not regulating helicopter flights at that height. Mm-hmm. And so in determining whether the government should be allowed to have a visual observation of your house from that height in a helicopter, they said, well, the FAA is not regulating it, so I guess they shouldn't. So this is back to say that we need rules, and we need rules now before these operations become commonplace, because what will happen if we wait and develop rules later is that then when there's a push for rules, people will say, well, you can't impose rules on this system. We have a functioning marketplace. There are drone operators up in the air, and if you impose rules, then jobs are going to be lost, then these businesses are going to have all these regulatory costs imposed. So really the time to write the rules is at the outset. And the FAA is moving, as Ryan has noted, incredibly slowly, and they need to be moving faster, but they don't need to just be moving faster by making a permissive system. They need to be moving faster to actually impose real rules, which is what Congress ordered them to do in the Modernization Act. I mean, Congress really said, look, drop a comprehensive plan, drop a roadmap, execute the plan, execute the roadmap through regulation. And in the comprehensive plan and the roadmap, and all throughout this process, the FAA has noted that there are significant privacy concerns with the operation of drones, as the questions and many of the comments have already highlighted, and that is part of the process. The FAA can't simply ignore that.
And I would just to add a little bit, it's difficult to try and predict the future when you create regulations around this type of technology. We're going to try and roll out a air traffic management system that could play very much into the rules. So going forward, as we create rules that govern drones, we need to be mindful of how the technology evolves and be flexible.
So quick note on the common law. Alan Butler is exactly right. Most of the rules and legal norms and causes of action that have cropped up around this area, trying to answer the question, what property rights does one have in the air above their home? What expectation of privacy does one have from government surveillance based out of an aircraft, whether it's photographic or just visual by law enforcement? Those common law principles and those determinations were made at a time that aviation was large, manned, and expensive. It is no longer any of those three things as it relates to UAS, okay? And that is why the president cares about this issue. That is why courts care about this issue. That is why people on this panel care about this issue, because I am not proposing a conclusion to that question or an answer to that question. But the reason that these questions are being reconsidered since the 40s and since the 80s and since the 90s is because those three things are no longer true. And as a practical matter, those are game changers. And you need thoughtful folks who have touch points in these areas to think about that and figure out whether or not those are distinctions that make a difference.
We had a question in the back, and then I'll come to you guys.
I mean, I get it, it's complicated, and while we're all waiting for the FAA, in the meantime, I'm counting on state legislature where the panic meter is huge. We've got, a zillion bills going through, not only at the state level, but at the local and municipality level, banning drones from flying over prison because they're going to deliver illegal drugs, as though it's not already illegal to do that. So we're battling all of these pieces of legislation that some legislators don't have the best and the brightest, and these things are being put into law, and that is also going to affect technology and further rulemaking. And I actually don't know what my question is. I'm kind of looking for, some authority that we can bring to bear on some of these legislators who, want to enact this stuff. So hopefully, it's going to end up just causing more confusion as we try to.
So actually, I'd like.
Briefly repeat the question into the microphone to the folks who are seeing it streamed.
Sure, absolutely. Oh no, moderator's
Basically,
privilege.
question about the issue of state legislation, and there have been 45 states, 166 UAS bills this year. There's a lot of concerns. How do we get this right? And
Yes. Well, on the point of state legislators not necessarily being the best and brightest, your words, not mine, it's not so much different in Congress. A week ago today, a week prior to today, the Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee on Aviation held a hearing with, I'm trying to think everyone who was there. We had the Airline Pilots Association, we had the Department of the Interior, we had the FAA, we had the Association of Model Aeronautics, I think they're called,
Yes.
and someone else, if I recall. Basically, the theme that went through your elected representatives in that committee was, do something. And the response from the FAA was, sorry we missed the deadlines, but they're coming, maybe, soon, maybe. I mean, the trouble is all of these questions are so complicated, and there are so many competing interests at stake here that the process that thus far has dragged on for the better part of 3 years doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. So people usually like to hear some type of solution to the quagmire in which we find ourselves. So I'll venture one. I don't know if it's the best solution. I don't know if it's a very good solution, but I think maybe what we should do is actually just adopt the Canadian regulatory model when it comes to the operation of commercial drones. It's simple, they're clear, and I know there are concerns about how, in some areas we need to fashion regulations and rules beforehand to make the lay of the land and the rules of the, air, not the road in this case, clear. I understand those are necessary, but generally speaking, I think a good first step would be to just allow for a blanket permissioned commercial drone operation for all drones under, say, 5 pounds or so. Maybe with some initial restrictions around urban centers to be sunset after NASA and Verizon and other private public partnerships have developed a more robust and a more effective drone traffic management system. But I think the important thing right now, quite frankly, is to get a lot of drones in the air, get a lot of people who want to build businesses behind them up and operating so that those people can start creating jobs, producing economic prosperity. And then as we start to deal with some of the smaller scale issues, as more and more people enter the airspace, then we can actually craft more ideal regulations, but not before the problems actually arise.
And to that point, and then we'll go around the room quickly, we do see states creating a lot of duplicative laws, like you said. All 50 states currently have voyeurism laws for the most part. They vary in regulatory strength, But we see states like Arkansas create another voyeurism law that's only technology specific to drones when it's not necessarily needed. So I think a big part of this is educating state lawmakers, because we see certain bills go down in committee in states just because we already have this covered, but it is a problem. So a lot of it will be education, and we should rely on the federal government to kind of lead the way. We need the FAA to come up with some sort of rules so that they can start guiding lawmakers, and even our processes at the NTIA can help set it's just a guidance, but it can help push lawmakers in the right direction.
Yes, in the back.
Yeah, Claire Gashmi, I'm the executive director of the ACLU here in Virginia, and we were a prime mover in the drone moratorium 3 years ago, and then the warrant requirement that was imposed this year. And I will say that from the legislative perspective, my experience is that there isn't as much concern about the commercialization of the product, but about having pretty clear rules about the government use of the product, and also the data, and a concern that as commercialization comes forward, that if there aren't limits on the ability of the government to get the data from the commercial enterprises, that whatever lines you draw about government use become, essentially irrelevant. So, I mean, I've seen a couple of key, and contrary to Mr. McQuinn's statement, we've had several prosecutors already who have told us that, in fact, in Virginia, our voyeurism laws do not address voyeurism by drone. And so, that's one issue that I think people need to take a harder look at. But I think, as was the case with the California EPA, where the concentration there was on, let's talk about the rules that apply to government, and then let's get that settled, and then, if there's spin-off concerns about commercialization, that's a whole other issue. I think that approach would help the UAS industry, at least in the conversations I'm having with legislators in Virginia, to ensure that we have the right rules in place for government acquisition of the data, hoarding the data, use of the data, and it's because of the point you made. It's cheap. I mean, it's expensive to put people in a car to trail somebody 24/7. It's going to get increasingly cheaper to do that with a drone. So I think that parsing those things out will help in the conversation. But I think the reality is that unless there is some kind of consensus that develops around the regulation, you're not going to stop state legislatures and local governments from responding to their constituent concerns about privacy, particularly. And so with that, I think you can't wait for the FAA or the feds to do so.
Sure. So real quickly on the government front, and then I'll defer to others. February presidential memorandum does impose requirements on federal agencies and on any state or municipal entities who use federal money to purchase UAS. There are public reporting requirements in that document. Many agencies have already released their public reports. Some have not, and the deadline is I believe later this year. And we expect to see those soon. The truth is that if a state governmental entity or a municipal governmental entity purchases UAS with their own money, there are federalism concerns with the federal government imposing any requirements. So this becomes a state by state and municipal by municipal question. I think to the extent that the president wants to see operation that supports governmental purposes like mapping and fisheries monitoring and weather and law enforcement and all those good things, that we have made real strides and concrete progress on those issues. There are areas where state and municipal governments operate that the feds, I think quite properly, cannot put a thumb on the scale. So that's going to be state by state in Virginia. It's going to be municipality by municipality across the country, and we'll sort of go from there.
I think, so I'll just start by saying, I think the idea of simply blanket authorizing drone operations without first setting even just baseline privacy rules is a terrible idea. I just reject that idea outright. And to just use as an example, this idea that sort of we'll just roll out new technologies and new devices and it'll all be fine and we'll regulate small issues later. there was this new technology a couple years ago, I believe it was called Google Street View, and Google decided to go out and take pictures of houses and street corners, etc. And then years later, through what was essentially an accident and several years of like knockout, drag-out fighting from European regulatory agencies, we found out that a Google engineer had put a little piece of code in there that scraped Wi-Fi data of all of the private businesses and homes that they were driving by, and was actually downloading unencrypted payload data from people's home networks. So that didn't work out so well in terms of just, oh, we'll roll out new technologies and everything will work out great. Now to touch on a few points that were brought up earlier, I mean, I think as to transparency, I think it's going to end up being a very important but not complete part of privacy rules. And, you know, Alan mentioned earlier this point about, back a little bit to the safety concerns, contrasting this with, let's say, laser pointers. I will note that both on related to transparency and related to rules, that if you had transparency with people who were, if you somehow were able to have transparency with people who are using these laser pointers at planes, it would be a lot easier to bring criminal enforcement against them, which states are doing, by the way, with increasing penalties. So it's not like we're ignoring that problem. That's not really a good example of how, oh, we just like let things go the way they go. I think we impose we have rules and then we fix them as necessary. And I think that more than just transparency, there need to be rules that provide a degree of control, because it's not just enough for people to know that there's data being collected about them. And I also don't think it's all just about secrecy here. It's not just about people not knowing information about me. It's about individuals having control over the data that's collected about them, especially data that's collected about them when they're in their own homes, they're on their own private property. I mean, I think people have a right to not just have data collection devices above their house, whether it's directly over their backyard or not, collecting information about them at all times without any mechanism to know or control that collection.
And just to respond to that, again, we should create mechanisms that make sure that people's information are private. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't go after laser pointers. I'm just saying that everyone's kind of focused on drones, and we're not really that focused on it, at least in the public sphere.
Yes.
I mean, drones do put some of the most invasive technology on your platform that is cheaper, easier to use, and you guys say cooler than I think mostly that we've ever seen before. So I have concerns that way, and potentially one of the reasons we're seeing very few incidents is because there are very few cases of them being done right now, whereas there are lots of laser pointers that are out in the world. So that might not be indicative of the problem, but more of the volume. But what Ryan said actually caused a visceral reaction in me. Because, and my question is, have any of you ever flown or, dare say, touched a drone? Matt Waite at the University of Nebraska actually called them flying lawnmowers. So the idea that we want as many of these things in the sky as possible, as quickly as possible, without thinking through the privacy or safety concerns of them, is actually, to me, not only concerning from a privacy perspective, but terrifying from a safety perspective. We've already seen a guy in New York scalp himself with his own drone, let alone he fly one over a crowd and it gets caught by a wind gust and goes into that crowd, and you see people getting cut up fairly badly. What is your personal experience with drones coming out and saying, like, we need as many of these up as possible, or they don't cause a privacy concern, or any of the statements that you're making?
Sure. Yeah, so first off, thank you to Amy for the question. We're actually going to be on an encryption panel next week talking to Hill staffers about why encryption is important. But I'm glad to argue with you today about these points. Yeah, no, I have flown drones before, yes, and I have been struck by drones before. Now, admittedly, it was in an office setting, and we were not supposed to be playing with it in there, but like, you know, like folks will do when the boss is away, we did anyways.
Alan used to strike me with them all the time.
That does not surprise me at all. That's why he's a defender.
Which Alan?
Not intentional.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought a bit. Yeah, no, look, I get the privacy and security concerns. I do. And I hate to go on to a segue like I'm about to do, because it seems like I'm circumventing the question, but I promise you I will return to it with a solid answer. 33,000 people die every single year as a result of automobiles. Human error specific in automobiles, whether people are crossing a line when they shouldn't be, whether people are drinking while driving. I mean, that's 100 people a day. And we as a society, not just as individuals, but as society as a whole, we tolerate it because we look at the costs and we look at the benefits and we say, okay, this sucks, but sometimes you just kind of have to bite the bullet on that stuff. And I know that's very that's almost dismissive, and I don't want it to.
We regulate driving intensely.
And people still die. That's the point. Yes.
More would die if we didn't regulate.
I mean, that's well. I mean, that's this. Look, I don't want to get into it. I'm not here lobbying on behalf of the automotive industry. My simple point is that in everything we do, security, privacy, in everything that we do as a society and individuals, there are trade-offs. And I would like to address every single privacy and every single security concern that we possibly can surrounding the use of drones. The simple fact of the matter is we don't know all of those problems until they actually happen, and we can't address a problem that we haven't yet seen. Basically, is my point. And, to be fair to the Canadians, they've operated with this blanket permissioned approach to using drones, and they're on, Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, they're on their third round of drone rules, and they're not experiencing the types of problems that a lot of people in this country are making commercial drones out to be. So I'm not saying just throw them up in the air and let's be done with it, and then everyone just, we'll see what, comes our way. But, if the FAA is going to keep dragging its feet in this issue space, then I would say Congress probably needs to act. The point, all I'm trying to do is defend the innovators because I want to start getting stuff delivered to my drone.
Canada also has a data protection authority.
Yes.
And just to say, they started with Canada started with a very lax policy and then made it stronger and stronger as they saw the need to.
One more data point I'll add in there is that the FAA actually already imposed certain privacy rules on its drone test sites. Mm-hmm. So if we're talking about baselines, for the agency in its most recent NPRM to not even bring in its own privacy rules that it imposed on the test sites is just irrational. So, and I think we're in agreement that we're not totally dealing with a rational actor on the part of the FAA here.
I am on the record. I am not in agreement that the FAA is an irrational actor.
Close.
Anyone else out there? Any questions? No need to be shy.
I would like to make the point, just something that I missed in my initial go around, is that hobbyists created this industry. We really didn't have any drones 10 years ago, and people tinkered and they created. And even the founder of 3D robotics he's a self-taught programmer for 7 years ago near the Mexican border who just loved to fly these things. So going forward, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I'm wary of imposing technical standards on people being able to tinker with software for these devices, as we've seen with a few different bills that are out there. So while I do think that certain things like geofencing might be a great idea, be wary of kind of creating a closed system around drone technology. Open source.
Another thing I'll point out about hobbyists, interesting bit of history, there was a lot of hobbyist concerns surrounding the passage of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act in the 1980s. Specifically, people were concerned about hobbyist operators of CB and other types of radio because obviously it was a comprehensive law to address the collection of radio signals, and they actually were able to carve out a hobbyist rule in those systems. Ironically, Google then later tried to use the hobbyist exception to get out of liability in the Street View case and lost. So that didn't work out. So I think in that case, you have another situation where there were regulations on communications privacy in the infancy of the internet, and the internet was still able to develop and thrive, and also there were baseline rules. So.
Yes.
I apologize, I wasn't in your session. Did you talk about how easy they are to hack? So it's a great presentation at that time called How I Hacked My Neighbor's Kid's Drone. Apparently this guy saw the next door neighbor kid got a drone, and so he made it so it would fly and then it would stop and the fat kid would run after it, and then just when he got to it, it would take off again. Then what he did is he went into an FTP, he discovered that he could run FTP and tell that and all the other protocols on it, and what he found out is that there was video of his teenage daughter inside that thing. So his whole point is that they're basically flying wireless access points.
My friend over at Carl Sabo from NetChoice coined them. He said that they were flying iPads. Yeah.
Anybody else want to touch
iPads.
on the hacking?
Real quick, two issues on the hacking. One is command and control, right? And
There is none, according to this guy. It's, if you know what you're doing and you can run something in FTP, you can own them.
sure. So there's no question that there's a heterogeneous ecosystem for command and control, depending on the brand, depending on the underlying technology, right? So depending on whether these are consumer products, whether these are products that are sold to BOD and folks like that, and the FAA has addressed that question of a secure command and control link with the proposed rule. That proposed rule is not in effect right now. It's not in effect today, but that is something that they see as part of their core safety mission, the ability of only the authorized operator to maintain control over the physical vehicle. The second question, though, as you said, is the data, is the payload data, not command and control. And that is a much thornier question. That is something that the FAA does not address in the small UAS rule, and it is something that has been the topic of much discussion in the process that we've organized between industry advocates and technical experts to try to figure out a way to mitigate some of those risks and enhance the security of the payload data.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll note on that is anytime you have a new system being rolled out that collects and potentially stores and transmits a large amount of sensitive and potentially interesting information, you're going to have, that's an attack space. You're going to have people out there trying to get access to it. And there have to be, I mean, I think this was mentioned in the encryption video we just watched. I mean, you have to have incentives. You have to have incentives, rules that create incentives to protect that information. Otherwise, I mean, we know what happens in the federal government OPM and in the private sector data breaches when there aren't adequate incentives to protect that data.
Well, the fact that most of them were Jason control.
There's your incentives.
We have just about 3 more minutes. Time for maybe a couple more questions. If not, I'm going to let everybody do just kind of a closing statement here. Want to kick it off, Ryan?
Sure. So, lots of fun discussions. I just want to clarify, I am not some sort of anarchist when it comes to regulations. I do understand all of the concerns that the various stakeholders have. I think everyone sitting here is largely in agreement, and where we do disagree, it's on the margins about how best to proceed, given the fact that I think if there's one thing we can all agree on, except for Mr. Verde, it's that the FAA clearly has not been doing a very good job trying to do its job. So maybe it's time to kick the ball back to Congress. But the one thing I'd like to leave you with is this idea that, again, we live in a complicated world, and you're never going to get 100% of what you want, whether it's privacy, whether it's security or safety. You know, the reality is there are trade-offs associated with simply being alive and existing in our society. So my proposal would be simple rules for a complex world, just like Mr. Epstein said in his famous magnum opus. And I think if we get those very simple rules right broadly, I think it's an excellent starting point for actually allowing this ecosystem to thrive and evolve and make us all healthy, wealthy, and wise.
Right. So I agree we live in a complex world. I don't think that absolves us from the obligation to make wise policy. And I think there's wise policy being made on any number of fronts that can always be better informed by greater participation by advocates, technical experts, representatives from industry, and our colleagues in government.
I look forward to working on this issue further, and if anyone in the room has any questions going forward, I hope if you have the ability to come participate in the NTIA multi-stakeholder process, it's riveting. And that was only partially sarcastic, because John's doing a great job. But going forward, I would say that a good recipe for protecting innovation, as we also protect privacy and safety, is to make the rules flexible, make them tech neutral, and make them risk-based. So, thank you.
I think what's interesting here is that we hear from pretty much everyone on the panel that we need to have baseline rules. And that's where I start. And where I also start is the law that Congress already passed, which is the FAA Modernization Act in 2012, that requires the FAA to establish those rules. And that's where we are right now. We've sued the agency for failure to do so with respect to privacy, to initiate a rulemaking on that issue. And we're going to continue to pursue that effort because, frankly, Congress has a system in mind to regulate drones. That's currently through the FAA. And we need baseline rules. We all seem to be in agreement there. The FAA has already started the process. They've already had privacy rules in the drone test sites, and they need to take the next logical step.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Are they aircraft in the United States? Is that been decided?
Are they aircraft?
Yeah, they're aircraft.
They're
I
absolutely.
heard a lawyer
Unmanned
say
aircraft
that
systems.
it's illegal to shoot down aircraft, and it's a gray area whether they actually are aircraft.
Well, if you shoot down a drone, then you're liable for property damage.
But at least we
That's
open
what
a
I'm
line of
trying to figure, is it
right?
technically an aircraft?
If you ask the FAA, they'll say it's an aircraft. There's a specific definition, I think it's 331, section 331 of the FAA Act, and they claim it's an aircraft. And that is where it is that definition of aircraft from which they derive their authority to promulgate the rules at all. Yeah, because I mean, we throw footballs in the National Airspace System all the time, but they're not aircraft.
Thanks.
Cool. No problem. No problem. It was good. It was a good time. That was great.
I think it was great.
Yeah, that was cool. Well, I really appreciate it. Thanks, man. Thank you so much. We have to get back to the office. My email is blue.
How are you?
You're gonna have to maybe a smoke.
Huh?
Maybe a smoke.
No, you can go ahead. I'll meet you out there.
Oh no, I
I think I'm also taking him back.
Oh, with that?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure.
Josh knew. Did you
I'm gonna go to
Snapchat?
the bathroom. I'll
It was so nice to meet you.
There are 4 mics but 3 seats.
Maybe the back just rotates which one's got the highest gain. Yeah, it is.
Ragtag group of people conferencing. That's how I saw it. That's how I saw it.
I was trying to figure out how formal to dress.
Yeah, I mean,
So having to give special permission to all the safety rules, really can't do anything now. Having had Charles and nobody believes that more staff. But so that's
candies.
Yeah. I'm just finishing my second Z-Pack of the month, so I'm like trying to.
Tis the season.
Yeah.
Alright, so I'll just go down and let you guys introduce yourselves. Maybe I'll start with Alex, so that it's kind of like we'll work back towards you. Okay?
That's fine with me. I'm pretty easygoing for things that don't matter.
Alright.
Which I think is the way to be.
Yeah.
Care intensely about the things that matter and let everything else slide.
Yeah.
These things are the best.
Yeah. Sometimes I want my coffee to get cold.
Right? right? They're almost too good.
I got one drink my coffee. I wonder if there's a person who's like in charge of this room.
In charge of what?
The room, like telling us what to start.
There's a.
Is that me?
It might be you. There's a very well-dressed somebody that switched the name cards.
Oh, really?
I try to be modern and prepare all my notes on my phone.
They want to be like fancy.
And I realize I'm going to look really unprofessional looking down at my phone.
Well, if it makes me feel better.
Perhaps they're all
Looks like right now?
What happened to it?
I wonder if the big one is more professional than I do.
Is that because it was in rice or something, or?
No, it's because I dropped it on its face and then I cracked the glass. And now I've been having hallucinations about tiny shards of glass.
Like cutting your.
Cutting me in random places, so I've been putting it in a bag.
I did that too, and I'm supposed to get a free replacement of this one.
Yeah.
And I've just never done it.
Yeah, I've had this for like 3 weeks.
Crack mine as well.
It just hasn't been enough of a problem for me to try.
Because the issue was like, you have to go like 4 or 5 days without a phone until they mail you a new one.
Right.
It's not worth it.
Yeah, absolutely.
This day and age.
You think they just had one in stores?
Like, I'm very new to
No dice, unfortunately.
They do. It seems like they don't really actually have very much to do, right? Every time I go there, they're like,
My
you can't
co-founder gets all
possibly do that in
the
store.
really awesome speaking engagements, so
I
I
don't
figure I
even
have to
agree
pull
with
my
all
weight once in a
sales
while.
I don't know if there's actually gonna hide this.
Yeah, like I said over the phone a couple times, it's crazy how
we start at 2:30.
How my interest in this nonprofit
Big crowd.
privacy background so quickly.
Yeah,
we could just do like a one-on-one conversation.
Yeah.
Some of it is like a forced conversation.
Yeah.
Like this is almost certainly going to come up.
What do you?
Let's just try to like.
They should have had food.
Right, they did.
It would make sense.
I don't know. Nobody's here. Hey everybody. I don't know if someone's actually in charge. Does anybody else know? Cool. We'll assume it's us. Welcome. Thanks for stopping by for a panel that's like pretty off topic, I think, at the outset from the rest of the conference. I'm glad that you guys are curious about this topic. So I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves in a second. My name is Allie Lang. I work at the Center for Democracy and Technology on the consumer privacy team. And I just kind of wanted to lay a little bit of groundwork on why we decided to have this panel here at this conference and sort of why this is an interesting topic for us. I think one thing that's important to mention at the outset is that one of CDT's sort of frameworks in thinking about digital technology and liberty in terms of online and technology questions is to think of things in the framework of your digital self. So this is everything that you have online or your accounts that you have, anything that is sort of transmittal or networked creates an impression of you and sort of creates a variant of your identity that we would think that you should control. So this is sort of one of the frameworks we use to think about where we want to interject ourselves in our advocacy and also just thinking about what life is like and really paying attention to how technology influences the way that we approach the world and the way that we exist in the world. So thinking about food in that context is really interesting. We've been thinking a lot about the value, just the monetary value of health-related data. So if you think about what we've seen with wearables and things like this, there's really no reason you couldn't imagine seeing data about food going in the same direction. There's a lot of implications about your health. There's a lot of things that you could deduce about somebody if you knew what they were eating. But more importantly, I think there's a lot of pieces of our identity that are wrapped up in what we're eating, where we're eating, and with whom we're eating. Just as a sort of simple example, you can pretty easily imagine making some solid inferences about a person's heritage based on their diet or other cultural sort of things you could learn about them. So it's a really interesting data set. And the more I've sort of dug into this, the more I've realized that there are so many layers collected about food, of data collected about, from soil to table. So today we sort of have like a more specific subtopic in mind, although I think in general we're still talking about technology's influence on this daily life of food. But our panelists are sort of mostly thinking about food waste and how technology can solve this problem, but also kind of want to keep an eye on the idea of, what futures do we not want to see happen, and what sort of policy and advocacy decisions can we make now to sort of steer us towards an ideal future in terms of technology's role in preventing or mitigating food waste. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm going to let my panel introduce themselves, starting with Alex Haber on the end. So go ahead.
Hi Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Haber. I work for the Capital Area Food Bank here in DC. It's the largest hunger-related organization in the DC area. We distribute about 45 million pounds of food every year through about 450 community partners. And we are pretty entrenched in the country's politics about food waste. There are something like 300 food banks across the country who receive food from a variety of different sources. We do some purchasing, we get some from the government, but a lot of what we get is the food waste that comes from retail stores, from Giants and Safeways and Shoppers, and we pick up food and then distribute it through our 450 partners. And so obviously technology is entrenched in everything that we do, and as is food waste.
Hi, my name is Joshua New. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation. We're part of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is a mouthful, I'm sorry. So we are a public policy think tank. We focus on the intersection of data, technology, and public policy. Food does fit into that, but it might be kind of more tangential than what some of these guys talk about. We focus on three kind of main buckets of issues. We focus on big data, so predictive analytics, artificial intelligence, data visualization, what that means for the public and private sectors, open government data, and then the Internet of Things, all of which do relate to food, and I can wait to get into them to talk about actual specific examples. So this should be a really interesting panel. I think my expertise is going to be a lot more on how data analytics, sensorization of the world of food supply chains can really kind of align the supply and demand mismatch that results in food being wasted in the first place.
Hi, my name is Chris Bernstein. I work for the Food Safety and Inspection Service with U.S. Department of Agriculture. So my agency is actually in charge of making sure the supply of meat, poultry, and egg products in the U.S. is safe and healthy. We have inspectors in all the processing facilities here in the United States who actually sit there and make sure that stuff is safe. And as a result of that, we do consumer outreach. You can get a perfectly good chicken breast or a perfectly good steak, but if you don't prepare it properly at home, it can still actually make you sick. So we do consumer outreach, and as a result of that, we've actually had something called our meat and poultry hotline for about 30 years, which is a food safety hotline consumers can call and just ask general food safety questions. What we have found is that oftentimes consumers call us because they're concerned about the safety and quality of food. They say, oh, I've had this mayonnaise in my fridge for 2 years. Is it going to make me sick? We get those sorts of questions a lot. So in the mid-90s, we actually created a publication called The Food Keeper, which we developed with Cornell University and an organization based in this area called the Food Marketing Institute, FMI, which works with retailers throughout the country, Wegmans, Shoppers, Safeway, all of those. So we created this brochure that basically covers safe food storage and handling that consumers could use to basically make sure that what they're eating is not going to make them sick and they know how to store food properly. We updated that in 2014, and we decided that we were going to join the 21st century and actually created an application with that data, which we call the Food Keeper app. It launched this April on Google Play and iTunes Store. And with that information, we've really entered a different audience, and now we're working with folks like those on this panel because now we have all sorts of great data that backs up this application that we can share with others. So we're working on turning that app into an API to let as many folks use it as we want. I've worked with partners since we launched it as diverse as the University of Georgia, the Food Management Organization in Saudi Arabia, Wegmans Grocery, to just give them the data and they can integrate it however they want. So it's been a great opportunity for us at the U.S. Department of Agriculture to promote this information that we've developed with nutritionists and with dietitians and with home economists to make sure that folks are being healthy and they're following the recommended guidelines that we have for these products. So.
Hi, everyone. My name is Grant Nelson. I'm the co-founder of the Means database, which is an online notification platform for food banks, food pantries, etc., that allows them to basically sign up for alerts that tells them when food is made available for donation within a range they specify and matching categories they specify. We don't do any transportation. We just do the data alert system part of the equation. Other than that, I'm a full-time law student at GW in my third year. I do a lot of data privacy stuff, and I'm lucky enough to have spent the last summer working at Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society on the privacy tools team, where I assisted the legal team working on an interdisciplinary approach to managing large data sets in a privacy protective way with the computer science and cryptology team. And I'm a budding data scientist, currently procrastinating on a project or two that I should have done. And I wrote a lot of the code for the initial version of the Means database. So I'm glad to be here. Glad to talk about the intersection of two things I never thought would collide in my life: reducing food waste and privacy law.
Cool. Thanks, you guys. That's really awesome to hear about all of your good work. The first question I have, I think anybody can answer. I'm sort of most curious to hear Chris's perspective, but I'm curious to hear what you guys think about how we should share data between private enterprise, sort of nonprofits, and the government. How do, in terms of solving the food waste problem and all the data that could be collected or is collected, how do we sort of decide who should get to see that and what they should get to do with it? So, Chris, I'm curious from your perspective, just because you work in the government, what interest you guys might have in any of this data, or because it comes with responsibilities, I assume, and sort of what barriers you faced when you were working on your Foodkeeper app, or lessons that you learned in terms of, you know, how the government thinks about that kind of question.
Yeah, so there's a lot of regulatory requirements that we have to meet when we put out something like API, or we put out an application like the Foodkeeper. And basically, the application that we developed is a fully self-contained ecosystem, so it doesn't communicate with us at all. Now, I know a lot of shopper cards and rewards programs and stuff like that have more of a two-way communication, but from the government perspective, as we're putting this information out for consumer use, there is a line that we cannot cross. Now, for privacy and technology, that's something that a lot of corporations don't necessarily have as strict a requirement with. And it's really up to consumers and advocacy organizations to lay out for those retailers, you know, what their expectations are for privacy and how far they're willing to go, you know, to get $5 off their grocery bill or whatever. Now, the tracking that retailers do does have very positive and very meaningful public health consequences for an agency like FSIS. When we announce recalls for products, we usually work with retailers because we can track the lots that are shipped from manufacturing facilities down to specific retailers and states. And what's been really great for us is that, you know, if something was recalled at Safeways in Washington, D.C., they can actually get as granular to see who had purchased the recalled product and reach out to those individuals. So there's a very clear and helpful public health consequence to maintaining some of that, you know, personally identifiable information from somebody. There's just, you know...
It's not sure who it should be, maybe?
Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. Josh, what do you think about sharing data? Pro?
Pro sharing data. Before I get into that, I'm curious. So a retailer is allowed to reach out to a consumer based on their purchasing history and target specific individuals. What are are there different rules for doing that in a situation where it's not really like a matter of safety? So like say there's a bunch of food that's about to expire and they notice that, oh, you like to buy steaks. I was talking about this example earlier. You like to buy steaks. It's going bad. Here's like a flash sale, and they can actually pinpoint granular advertising to those people. When I don't even know if they can do that, but I mean, is that something you've experienced or not?
So the regulatory authority that we have wouldn't really govern engaging consumers in that capacity. It would really have to be a public health issue, and buying a steak that is close to expiration date would be the consumer's choice.
Sure. Okay.
Instead of, you know, having them purchase something that they know there is, say, an E. coli or a salmonella in or something like that.
So then I guess my point would be there I think that would be a really valuable opportunity. I'm getting a lot of feedback. Sorry. That would be a really valuable opportunity to reduce waste instead of grocery stores. Unfortunately, it would mean probably less food going to food pantries. But being able to target consumers to accurately figure out what they want and when they want it and get those products to them, I think grocery stores would have to do a very, very good job of explaining to people why you're going to be getting notifications when food you like is on sale, because I think that would freak a lot of people out. But in general, I think that would be a net benefit for reducing waste for grocery stores, business, and for consumers. In terms of sharing data in general, your original question, there are a lot of kind of multi-stakeholder data exchanges. There's for a whole different host of reasons that involve governments, academic institutions, private sector groups, civil society groups. One of the most famous ones that got in the news recently was the humanitarian data exchange. Whenever there's a natural disaster, it basically it's analogous to data.gov. Basically, anyone can upload a data set that is relevant to humanitarian efforts. It's topography maps, it's storm predictions, it's food access, it's cost of living, it's access to medical supplies. There are, from what I could tell, scant few resources related to food like that specifically. The UN has one called In Food, which is focused more on the actual composition of food, the kind of ingredients, the kind of pesticides used, the kind of health concerns that might bring up. And people do use that for resource allocation planning. But from what I can tell, there's not really a platform for that kind of data exchange, at least on the national level, specifically for connecting food to people who need it. Other than like these databases that connect people, specific grocery stores with food pantries, there's not a kind of municipal city food data sharing platform for food data specifically. If that needs to be separate than actual existing data platforms, I'm not really sure, but most of the city data portals I could find don't have specific food sharing categories.
Do the practitioners have views on what kind of information you would like to share with the government, which kind of information you'd like to get from partners, or like what would be useful to you to continue to build your practice in terms of information that other entities in the system might be holding?
So a great example for us is that we just launched this new project, the Hunger Heat Map, which is a new, really exciting mapping project that we've just launched, which takes a look at the food that we're distributing in the community and compares it to the need, and then allows us to have really great insights on where the gaps are and where we should be moving our food to. And it's this incredible new tool. We've gotten to make a lot of changes about it, but it's limited because it's based solely on our data and on government data, on USDA food security data. And so we've been starting the conversation with a lot of our partners to get a lot of their information as well, things like where their clients live, so where the food is actually being distributed to, or what kind of food they get from sources other than us. I mean, they get a lot of food from us, but many of them, especially the larger pantries, receive food from private donors as well. And I think we have had some difficulty. I think people see the opportunity of sharing data, especially across things like nonprofits. You see so many nonprofits that are doing really similar work, and people wonder, why aren't these people working together? And I think the answer is it's just not that easy. I mean, we have 450 community partners that we work with, and they range from huge organizations like Alive and Manna in Montgomery County that function really independently, all the way down to the tiny hole-in-the-wall food pantry that's in the basement of a church and is managed by a volunteer who's been there 20 years and has never touched a computer before. And that exists. And I think a lot of times when we have these technology conversations, we sort of forget about the huge population that still just isn't computer savvy. And when you do that, you want to take as much information as you can, but you have to make sure that there's data integrity. You have to make sure that you understand how it was collected. And we have a huge range from people who are collecting day-to-day client information from everybody who walks in their doors to people who, put a check mark on a piece of paper and then maybe type it up, or more likely stick it in a folder somewhere and then never look at it again. And it's a huge variety. And so I think the practical concerns are very real.
So so the Means database won the GW Business Plan competition this spring, which gave us a lot of publicity and a little bit of capital to do some reaching out and outreach. The people that have called us back have sometimes asked us if we're giving away computers. So I definitely feel you on the technologically savvy part of things. And you're right, there's a lot of people that are not taking as much advantage of the technological advances that we're creating as they certainly could. So I empathize with you on that one. The not working together question, the why aren't we working together question, why isn't, various nonprofits that do the same thing teaming up, is kind of the part of the reason why we created the means database, with the point of creating just an information exchange. We're actively working on an API that we want to make available to basically everyone that is interested in plugging into it. So the original question of how can we optimize data sharing first asks what's the response variable, what are we optimizing for? If it's just for sharing important information to those that can make the best use of it, I think the answer is APIs, APIs, APIs across the board. And so what the means database is trying to do is create a platform that allows anyone, such as a Feeding America food bank or an unaffiliated food pantry, to be able to get the notification about the food that's available near them and let them do the decision as to whether or not it's something that they want, to allow other developers to create applications built on top of our data set, and to allow, say, different networks. For example, if we have a regional food bank network that is, I don't know if this is even true, but unaffiliated with Feeding America, and say Feeding America food banks nearby, Means would like to be able to have an API that's robust enough that their developers and tech-savvy people can build apps that communicate with each other. And we think this is the way forward in terms of sharing information effectively. For example, the Food Keeper app, we're looking forward to the API being built so we can offer suggestions for items being posted and when their expiration dates are as reported by the user versus what the government tells us their expiration dates probably are. So in short, I think the answer is APIs and a fair amount of privacy protections for the more sensitive data.
I actually want to jump a little bit back to something that Chris and Josh were talking about with the stakes. We had this sort of related conversation in another event that CDT had, but the question wasn't about offering consumers a discount. It was about trying to figure out a way to redistribute those resources, like if it's a stake especially, or something that's sort of out of scope under most circumstances, to people who are on SNAP beneficiaries or on other sort of public assistance. And so saying, the way that we offer extra incentive for people to come to farmers markets and say, okay, you get twice as much worth of vegetables if you come to a farmers market as you would at a grocery store, saying, okay, the stakes are on sale. If you go get them now, your EBT card will automatically, without you sort of having to have an extra piece of paper or take an extra step, the technology will automatically provide you with enough money to get these stakes, even though it's probably outside of your normal budget. So sort of like ups and downs to creating a technology that could do that. We actually had a different representative from the USDA on that panel, and she seemed pretty convinced that the USDA didn't want to try and do this. But it's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about trying to redistribute to the store, but I'm curious if you guys have any perspective. I know you guys maybe don't work directly with vulnerable populations, but with upgrading that kind of technology from the USDA, where you could say, okay, now your EBT card has the power to know who you are specifically and offer you specific personalized discounts or sort of better information, but also maybe it prohibits you from using this card in a totally self-determined way. I'd be curious to hear your guys' perspective on something like that.
Sure. So we do a lot of work on an issue we call data poverty. It's what happens. So as the world becomes more data driven, more decisions can be made based on data collected about you or your business. What happens when people are kind of left out of that data collection? Existing disparities will become exacerbated. Underserved communities will be comparatively even more underserved. So this kind of example, could work with a customer loyalty card. It could work with a credit card today. Probably does. So what happens when in underserved communities, someone on SNAP benefits, someone using an EBT card doesn't have the kind of data, either access to data about these kind of sales or data collected about them, saying like, oh, you shop in these grocery stores, we know specifically who you are, we can target you with with a little more access to food than we basically could with kind of a dumb, non-dynamic system that doesn't incorporate data about real-time events. That is something that I would really like to see. That might be a pretty challenging undertaking to do. And I think it also runs the risk from a social justice perspective that sure, it means more access to food and it means more access or it means less food waste, but you run the risk of putting a lot of food, almost secondhand food is the only food that you're giving to these participants, and that might have some ethical quandaries. But if it means giving them more access to food than before, I think that would be a net benefit.
What if Chris promises that the food is safe?
I mean, if it meets all safety guidelines and everything, I think that's totally fine. It just shouldn't be a situation where it's actually a health risk. I don't think it would be.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, it is unfortunate, but the political reality we live in now is that really any change to SNAP benefits becomes like a huge thing. So I think making drastic changes to to the program would be, I mean, that's like a definitely a long-term goal. It's not something that would be able to happen short-term just because of all of the political implications that it would have.
I don't know if either Grant or Alex has a response to Josh's comment on data poverty. Actually, that topic came up for me when you guys were describing sort of the people who don't have the food banks or the other sort of organizations you work with who don't have computer savviness on hand, or people, I'm sure it applies then also to their customers or sort of the clients of the system. Have you guys encountered any trouble as you've sort of moved into a more technologically driven solution to some of these problems with losing people who aren't able to share their data or access this kind of information, and how have you sort of addressed those things as they've come up?
Yeah, we've actually definitely had some troubles with that. I think an example, we just launched a custom CRM, a client relationship management system, and part of that CRM that we've just launched is having recording that we require from a lot of our different programs be on the computer. Whereas before they would handwrite it onto a piece of paper that we had sent them, and then they would fax it to us, and then one of our staff members, our full paid staff members, would spend a lot of their time typing in all this information from the fax sheets. And so we were really excited to move over to this new system where our sites were actually entering this information on their own. And in some ways it's been incredible because we've freed up all of this time that our staff members were taking to do all this data entry and all of this management. But at the same time, we've actually ended up nearly isolating a lot of our partners who just don't have the capabilities, they don't have the computers, they don't have the resources to be able to, follow those kinds of standards that we're setting up for them. And you end up sort of isolating this population that you've spent your entire career trying to support and provide resources to. And I think the issue of data poverty is really interesting because I think that a lot of people who you might consider in that population probably wouldn't see themselves that way. I think that that population, the population that we're serving, gets surveyed all the time. They get asked really personal questions about themselves, about their children, all the time. And we do it, right? We have to, because we have to prove to our donors and the community that we're doing a good job. But, if they're asked these same incredibly personal questions over and over again, I don't think they would consider themselves to be data impoverished.
I would agree with you, but so how do you collect this information? Because one of the biggest
still do.
Well, no, but no. So your actual survey method. So one of the biggest examples that we actually pointed to when we wrote our report about it, although I think it has since changed. The American Community Survey did a lot of information gathering based on either door-to-door surveys or phone surveys via landlines. And so many people, either one, don't speak English as their first language and they get a phone call and they can't respond to it. The government's supposed to account for that. Or they don't work normal business hours and they can't be at home. Or they're homeless or they don't have steady housing. That information can never be collected on them despite it being asked of a lot of people, even if it is sensitive data collection. So I think it is a tricky issue. I'm not accusing you or anything, but no, it is kind of a really hairy issue. It's really tied with the digital divide in general. And even if you are collecting information about these people, how the methods involved, who you reach out to, your sample size, all kind of need to be considered, and it's kind of a hairy issue.
Absolutely, and we use a lot of the ACS data as well, especially in our hunger heat map. I think being creative about the way that you're picking up information. If you decide that you're going to collect information this one route every time, you're going to end up missing people.
True.
Yeah.
So for means, because we don't engage with particular client individuals directly, we don't have a lot of super sensitive data on our system. We orient most of what we collect to trying to optimize the notification system, the matching system, and our outreach efforts for which locations across the U.S. are most likely to need a service like Means. Anytime you're talking about concerns about data use or data collection, the best solution to avoid a breach is just not to collect the data in the first place. The best solution to avoid having issues is not to collect it in the first place. So for the most part, we just don't collect information about individuals, because means is an organization to organization thing. So I don't have tons to add on that point, including, well, aside from we don't intend in the near future to start collecting individual level data either.
Great. I kind of want to turn to a topic of maybe more creative interest, which is sort of thinking forward about the future. I know, Josh, you mentioned earlier the role Internet of Things type of technology might play in trying to solve this problem in the future. I'm curious what you think and what all the panelists think about, what would be an ideal outcome in terms of trying to utilize more technology in solving food waste problems, and where you would focus that energy if you were in charge of that question. I guess if you could just sort of create the future, what kind of technologies would you want to see deployed on this problem? And then what technologies would, if there are any, that you think would be potentially really detrimental to trying to actually solve the problem?
So people who are much more involved with actual food waste could probably correct me if I'm wrong. But so when I was thinking about this, I could identify two primary ways that food is wasted. There's mismatched supply and demand, and then there's mistakes. There's negligence. There's overbroad recall notices. There's spoilage. People get lost on the shipping routes. Things like food gets wasted in a variety of ways, and that kind of happens, I think, at three identifiable points in the food supply chain. There's point of production. There's intermediaries, so grocery stores or restaurants, kind of point of sale people. There's the actual consumers themselves. And the Internet of Things in particular, maybe I'm biased because that's what I do like most of my work on, I think can affect every single one of these points enormously. I'm sure the term precision agriculture gets thrown around a lot, but basically sensorizing farmland, sensorizing agricultural production to have much, much more informed planting, harvesting, production decisions. If you can get data about what the market will be a month from now and your crops need a month to grow, you can plan to accurately meet that demand. You won't be wasting any product. Your crops will grow much more efficiently. You won't be wasting resources growing them. You won't lose food in the growing process. In the intermediary process, shipping to the restaurants selling them themselves. Restaurants know demand much better. They can keep track of their own inventory much better. I know this isn't traditionally food in the traditional sense, but there's a really interesting company called SteadyServe, which basically is like the internet of beer is how they brand themselves. So they install sensorized keg equipment, taps, restaurant management software that you can predict in real time what your demand will be. You can monitor in real time what's at the bottom of a keg what most restaurants might throw out, but that's like 4 more beers, and over a month, 4 more pours, over a month, that's like $100 in gallons of beers. That kind of system for food management absolutely can exist in the future. For grocery stores, the same thing. You know what demand is better. What your storage facility for food, you can monitor that much better and more efficiently. You're less likely to lose a room full of meat because it got too warm or something like that. And then consumers themselves, we talked about this in our planning call, the internet connected fridge gets brought up anytime anyone talks about the Internet of Things, and it's very frustrating because it's like, oh, this is the most frivolous product in the world, who would ever need this? But something we've looked into quite a bit is what that means. We've traditionally looked at it from a quality of life standpoint. So the elderly, people with disabilities, people who can't really always get up and go to their fridge and look inside and know when food is going to go bad, or know what kind of food they have so they don't go buy more, people suffering from dementia, or with very specific dietary constraints. This is like a really incredible opportunity to give them more control over their lives and actually make better use of food that they've already bought, or influence their planning decision much better so they don't end up throwing things out. And that is all because of very cheap connected sensors and ubiquitous connectivity. So that's my Internet of Things rant, and I'll let someone else talk.
So I can kind of piggyback off that too. So in terms of future work, a lot of what USDA does is trying to educate folks about the storage methods that should be used for kinds of foods so that you're buying appropriate quantities. Because what we find is that a significant portion of consumer food waste is just because people don't really understand how long something can safely be stored, and they buy 10 pounds of chicken breasts and then 6 pounds of them go bad just because that should actually only be in your fridge for 1 to 2 days before we don't recommend that you eat it anymore. So with the application that we have, we're working to integrate barcode scanning into the FoodKeeper application so that consumers can just scan whatever product they've just purchased at the grocery store, and as they're putting it into their refrigerator, they get a notification with the application that says you should really be using this product within X amount of X period. And so with that, consumers will buy less, and that way ultimately we're reducing the burden of food waste in landfills. So
I think one really interesting challenge that we've had is that we get a lot of food. We get 45 million pounds of food every year of what we call salvage, which is assorted food. It's a can of creamed corn and a box of cereal. It's assorted stuff that we get from food drives, from individuals and organizations, and then also what we get from a lot of these retail stores. And it comes in and it's a whole mishmash of items. And a big part of our work and a big part of what volunteers for us do is they sort this food into something that's actually usable. So we have this huge conveyor belt where you are assigned for the day to be the boxed and bagged soup guy. That's my favorite one. And you stand there and you stand around the conveyor belt and you grab all the boxed and bagged soup that comes by and you build a box of it, a case of it for our partners to take, because it's a little bit more, it's more manageable to get a box of boxed and bagged soups than it is to get, a whole mishmash of stuff. And it's a really resource-heavy process, but we have to do it because partners don't want to come and sort through all of this stuff. All of our 450 partners, they want this all to happen beforehand. And it's a really low-tech process that we go through, right? It's, human capital, people standing around a conveyor belt and putting things into boxes. And it's a process that works okay, but there are obviously a lot of problems that go along with it. For one, we don't do that great job of sorting. First of all, nobody really wants boxed and bagged soups. But we also, we could use more specificity in the types of vegetables. You get canned vegetables, and that could be all kinds of things. It could be green beans, it could be asparagus, it could be whatever. There's also food safety problems that go along with it, because it means that we have really no way to track food that comes from this particular food drive that goes to this particular partner, because it's all a big mishmash. And there's also, thirdly, there's a nutritional issue that goes along with it. We've been working really hard over the last couple of years to have a better understanding of the nutritional content of our food and to be able to provide healthy options for our partners. And when it's in this big mishmash, we have no idea if within that box it's 60% low sodium items. We have lots of clients we work with that have diabetes and hypertension and all of these diet-related illnesses. And so I would love to see some kind of technology that helps us improve that process, that allows us to better understand the content of this 4 or 5 million pounds of food that we get every year. That's just this whole big mishmash. If you guys have any ideas, come chat with me.
So I think what everybody's touched on is exactly what I've experienced. I think that the issue of food waste is absolutely one of supply and demand and misconnections at multiple levels of the chain. So Means is fundamentally a two-sided market maker, just doing the information transfer. We reduce the transaction cost and the search cost of making a donation, right? So things that we've had a lot of success and we think that we can improve on is moving things that are traditionally probably undonatable or uninteresting to a lot of recipients. For example, someone once posted 10 cans of beans, 10 pounds, various varieties. Whoever posted this clearly wasn't a salesperson and trying to get someone to claim it. But as it turns out, because their system is, so direct and clear about exactly what's available and what the categories are, like you can check vegetables, you can check low sodium, et cetera, for every donation. Somebody claimed it, and the transfer happened within 2 or 3 hours, and both sides rated it as a perfect 5-star transaction. So I think that in the future, what we hope to see for technology is almost frictionless transmission of information, and eventually probably payment systems and other ways to allocate the value required to make these sorts of transactions happen. So that's why we're working so hard on the API. That's why we're focusing on the data science of trying to make these connections happen in the most optimized way, trying to figure out who needs to be notified first in order to optimize for people that are interested in a particular product as soon as it's posted, who's most likely to pick it up and do a good job of picking it up, and making sure that everyone recognizes that your ratings on the system are actually meaningful. If your goal is simply to move food as soon as possible, you would tell everyone first thing every time something's posted. But if you want the system to have long-term value, you have to have some sort of feedback, some sort of mechanism that says, if you claim something, you have to go pick it up. You can't just claim everything that comes through the system. So I think in order to answer the question of what technology looks like in the future, is doing things like what Means does with like the high-speed matching of things. I think there's a lot of data science image recognition opportunity for Capital Area Food Bank. I've seen the conveyor belt; it's incredible. And the first thing that came to mind was surely some cameras and image recognition could help. But then I got to thinking about it, and I said, well, who knows what comes through the conveyor belt?
Weird stuff.
I imagine so, right? And that's kind of why we made Means, to try to capture a little bit of the quote weird stuff or the assorted things. If somebody has an entire pallet of something, Capital Area Food Bank's probably your go-to place because they can distribute that very quickly. But if you have like a third of a pallet or something, then perhaps Means would be a better solution to get it moved quickly, perhaps locally, super fast. So I think there's lots of opportunity to optimize all sorts of things, especially if you're able to pull in data from things like FoodKeeper, et cetera.
I actually want to respond to one of the ideas that Chris put out there with the USDA's plan to sort of integrate some more additional information into the barcodes of food. Is that something where, as you guys have thought about this, the digital divide conversation comes up when you think about it? And is there a solution that you guys have come up with to sort of address the idea that not everyone has an actual, like, we cannot scan? Or would there be like a scanner throughout grocery stores or?
No, so unfortunately, we have experienced that digital divide question with the application. So, and our response to that is that we have a physical publication for consumers that don't have the phone, so they can still access the information. We've already put the database itself on our website, foodsafety.gov, so that if you don't have the publication and you are maybe at the library or something and you're really motivated, I would love it if somebody is that motivated that they go to the library to get onto my website. But they could still, get the information on storage guidelines and cooking temperatures if it's meat or poultry or something like that. As we move farther down the line of a sophisticated app, at some point, we just can't offer a comparable service for consumers that don't have a smartphone. But looking at the latest Pew Research, I think the last survey they did was in September, so it's relatively recently, and the numbers were pretty positive. I think smartphone usage was above 70%. So, eventually I think that will shrink to a negligible point.
Interesting. Great. I'm curious if anybody in the audience has any questions for our expert panelists. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd love to hear a little bit more, touch a little bit on sort of higher up in the food system. Josh, you were talking about sensors in fields, because a lot of the waste doesn't happen at the store level and the home level. It happens at the food manufacturer level. It happens at stuff that's in the fields that just suddenly labor costs go up, prices drop on the profits, and a lot of work will more in the field. And to some extent, sensors will help with some of that, but sensors aren't going to tell you for a 3-month cycle what the weather's going to be like and how much extra you need to grow to make sure you're going to cover your contract, if you're selling to a packer or a cannery or something. So I'm curious about ideas where technology can help sort of higher up the food chain, where you start to have some really large quantities that unfortunately go waste.
So sensors can't solve for anything. We could have all the best, like the highest tech farm in the world, and of course it can't predict like demand shocks or like a freak storm that just wears patterns. But the point is, I think we're getting more and more data that gets us a lot better at predicting those kind of things and forecasting that we could never do before. So it's progress. I don't know if there's like a perfect end goal of not a single potato wasted or something, but that'd be great. But I think it's becoming dramatically more effective and much more efficient. It would be really interesting to kind of see how powerful these forecasts can get, but I'm not really sure if that one will be perfect.
PBS did a really interesting series, I think probably in July of this year, about food waste. They did a 3-part series on the nightly news program that they have. So if you check that out, they did one entire segment was about food waste on the farm and what folks are doing. I think they focused in California to get the food that's wasted in fields to folks that would be able to use it. So if that cauliflower head is too big and it just wouldn't sell at retail because it doesn't fit the mold that people think, they were working with food banks in the Southern California area to make sure that that food just wasn't left in the fields and it was distributed when appropriate.
And going off that, and maybe it's a competitor of the means database, so I don't mean to play favorites. There's a company called Food Cowboy, and so when a farmer or a packer or a canner sends a shipment to a grocery store or some other intermediary, and they miss their delivery window or the produce is ugly, it's not like grocery store perfect, they get refusal, they get turned away, and it's cheaper for that distributor to just throw away that food and go back and pick up another load. And Food Cowboy is basically an app that you basically can just plug in, I have this much food, I'm going to the landfill. If you can pick it up on the way, you remove the actual cost of sharing that information. You build frictionless information sharing. People will pick that up. They'll take it to food pantries. They'll take it to other sort of sellers that will either pay for the food or just take it off your hands because it's cheaper than driving all the way to the landfill. So there are a lot of kind of like value recapture mechanisms that are possible now that were never before too.
Yeah, I'm glad that PBS highlighted this, but food banks are a big part of that across the country. Food banks are, we've been around for 30 years, and we're a huge part of food waste in the country. And we do this, and food banks across the country do this, and it's gleaning is what we do, and we take the produce that doesn't look good enough to be in the grocery store and we distribute it. We've got a lot of partnerships with local farms and national farms as well that we pick up food from.
And what's really interesting about the ugly food component, is that consumers are actually really interested in that. So there are now chains of grocery stores that sell ugly food, and it's just the food that you can't ship to Whole Foods because it's not absolutely perfect. But consumers are really enthusiastic about buying that to reduce food waste and the burden that it creates.
Yeah, there's a farm-to-table concept that goes along with that.
Exactly.
I feel like there's a transparency, you know where your food is coming from.
Sorry, I was just going to say the survey of folks that I saw in this story about it was really interesting, because they said that the customers that were shopping at these ugly food grocery stores were much more satisfied with their produce than those that are buying the perfect produce from Whole Foods. So,
but their expectations are lower.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
You stated in the survey of the people buying the produce were more educated in higher, demographics than the people that are actually poor and in need of food. Because I would see personally, I would see that way, that people that actually could afford to buy the pretty and nice produce are the ones who are choosing to buy the ugly ones.
So I don't know. USDA didn't conduct the survey. I just read about it online. I'm sure if you just Google a couple keywords,
from your personal point of view, would you?
So I don't know. I think that it doesn't, socioeconomic class wouldn't really impact this, because consumers would understand that they're making a positive step towards reduction in food waste, which is a problem that I think a majority of Americans understand is an issue. It's maybe not their top priority of issues, but they understand that throwing food away is bad, and knowing that you are doing something to reduce that burden,
it probably depends on where people come from in a literal sense also, right? Like, if you grow up in a farming community in America or anywhere else, you may fall into some of these demographics that you're talking about, but you're much more familiar with the fact that bell peppers are sometimes squished in the middle. Like, that's something that you've personally seen, and you understand that it's still a good bell pepper. So if you grow up in a city and you grow up without a lot of resources, it may be less clear to you that the ugly food is exactly the same food, at least in an intuitive sense. But if you grow up farming and things like this, I think that there's like that connection that I think makes that, where that question would normally be a little bit more obvious. I think that sort of complicates it from my perspective, but that's not based on my expertise as anyone.
To answer your initial question about the importance of sensors and stuff, I'm pretty encouraged by the alignment of the profit incentive with not wasting food, especially at the earlier stages of food production. Like, the closer you get to the source, the more the profit incentive probably aligns. But at the same time, you have to just subtract from that the value added that they get. They probably have the highest margin as they're closest to the source. But generally speaking, I'm pretty encouraged by it. You mentioned the gleaning people. I think that, so Means has gotten a fair amount of interest from gleaners, because they say, we've already got this food, where do we take it? Which is a pretty big win-win, especially because a lot of food banks and food pantries don't have all the transportation infrastructure. Transportation is, of course, the most expensive part of any of this, and so obviously the biggest pain point. And on the who's buying the ugly food thing, I think your socioeconomic status probably impacts how price sensitive you are. And if you are so price insensitive that you are interested in the aesthetic of food, and then further beyond that, interested in the less aesthetically pleasing food, chances are you're probably from a higher socioeconomic, like, I don't know, class than someone else. I think price comes first, especially if you're short on money. I think that's the kind of clear answer, over-explained.
Thanks. So I heard a lot of mentions of reducing waste to landfills, but nothing about composting and dealing with food that's already spoiled or scraps, which is sort of unavoidable food waste. And I'm just wondering if any of you have considered it either from an education perspective, like Chris's app, or from connecting producers and users to just gather waste or anything like that.
We've gotten a lot of interest from composters that say, hey, when food expires on your system, what happens to it? And we said, well, that's a good question. I think we're going to open up a second version that says this food is clearly expired only for composters, kind of thing.
We actually send a lot of our food to the hog farm when our food goes bad. That's pretty much what we do with all of our fresh produce, and about a third of our food is fresh produce that we distribute, and so we're working to reduce our hog farm, because that's our food waste. You know, we're part of this sort of larger conversation about food waste, but our personal food waste, we're trying to reduce that and get as much of it out into the community as possible, but the excess does go to the hog.
Gotcha.
I really hate to bring a legal question into this because it's boring, but I'm going to ask anyway because I was just thinking about it. It really sounds like a good chunk of this is like a better safe than sorry stance that a lot of people are taking. I think from consumers, you think you're motivated by health concerns, you don't want to get sick, but if you're a distributor or manufacturer, you don't want to get sued. You don't want to violate a health code or, you know, have someone get sick and sue you and put you out of business. So I'm wondering, even if we start using data as efficiently as we possibly can, and even if we start using food as well as we possibly can, is there something about our law that's going to have to change?
I can answer this only because John Oliver just answered it, which is that there are laws to protect people who donate food from being sued, but people don't know about them.
Yeah.
So John Oliver is on it. That's my answer to that question, I think.
Expiration dates are a red line, though. If it's expired, you're out of luck. But yeah, besides that, you're...
So the interesting point about that is that expiration dates apart from baby food, babies are young, their immune systems are still developing, so they are required by law to put expiration dates on food because they are super at risk for foodborne illnesses. That's the only food that is required by law to have any sort of expiration date. So everything else is guidance by the food manufacturer about when they are saying this Pop-Tart is going to be at peak quality. And they don't want you to eat the Pop-Tart after it's peak quality because then you'll go tell all your friends that Pop-Tarts suck. So they want you to eat it by, October 14th. And if you eat it on October 15th, they can't guarantee it's going to be as delicious as a Pop-Tart is supposed to be. And that is a huge issue that we deal with on a regular basis is expiration dates, sell-by dates, best-by dates. What do they all mean? And, if industry wanted to standardize some of those terms, I think it would be a huge benefit for the consumer. Because also, if you buy rice that has an expiration date of tomorrow, it's going to be safe for another 8 months after that. And explaining that to consumers is a very challenging task because they see it and they think it's a hard and fast date. And then I'm going to throw out that 5-pound bag of rice I just bought, which, that could feed how many people at a food bank? Yeah.
We struggle with the same issues all the time. We get a lot of our food is past those best by dates, the expiration dates, and we are trying to educate our partners about what those dates actually mean, which often ends up being not that much. But it's challenging, and because if we give them something that's a week past the expiration date on the box, their clients, they turn around trying to give it to their clients, and the clients don't want them because there's just so little education about what those dates really mean. But a lot of them I mean, a lot of foods last significantly past those dates, but also for us, I mean, for example, we get a lot of frozen meat as cast off from grocery stores, and that actually lasts significantly longer if you put it at the right temperature, if you're able to store it at the right temperature. And so we sometimes have it for months, and it's actually fine to distribute, but there's just so much culture around what those dates mean and very little education.
Just a fact for everyone, meat does not go bad ever if it's in the freezer. So you could have a turkey in your freezer that was there 10 years ago. It might not taste great because it's going to be really dry because it was in the freezer for 10 years, but it's not going to make you sick. So
There's some supermarket sort of thing in Dorchester in Boston that is claiming to be selling nothing but expired foods precisely for that issue. I don't remember if it's open yet, but I don't think
It
they're
is.
really anticipating any legal issue.
yeah,
It's open.
I'm interested on the John Oliver point. I'm not aware of that, but I'm going to look that up when I get.
It's so great. That's actually this expiration date thing would be a very useful thing to embed into a barcode if the USDA was interested in, not the expiration date, but maybe just the manufacture date. If it was something where I could scan an item and understand better where it came from rather than when they think it's going to end, and then I could refer to the USDA resource, or especially for something industrial like what you guys are doing, that kind of information would be incredibly useful.
And that does exist. I mean, the UPC codes store a lot of that information. It stores when it leaves the factory and all of that
Awesome.
stuff.
There you go.
And there's huge databases that include that information. I mean, the manufacturer is generally required to provide that kind of information. It's just if you have access to it. But these databases are expensive, and that's definitely one solution we've thought about in terms of our salvage issue is using those UPC codes. But at this point, with our resources, the amount of time and energy and resources we would have to put in just so much outweigh what the benefit would be. But it exists.
I would add to that if I could. So I worked for food banks for years before I went back to school for information systems. So I'm also at this weird intersection of stuff that are positive combined. I'd say at the food bank level or the manufacturer level, there's still some room to get slightly conservative. But if you have something at your house, I always tell my friends, just open it up. Like there's very little that if it smells okay and the first taste is okay, it's basically fine, right? Nothing. With a few exceptions, nothing's going to kill you with one bite. So just try it. Generally, the answer is it's fine if it's on your shelf.
Cool. That is actually our time, but I don't see a crowd outside, so if anybody else wants to keep talking, you're welcome to. But
Do you guys see in the future nonprofits partnering with a for-profit like Lyft and Uber? Like they're already taking, let's say, Goodwill things, will they take food as well, share that data with?
You're working on that, aren't you, Grant?
Yeah, so basically every Uber driver doesn't want to deal with food as far as I can tell. I'm curious to see how that perception's changing now that they're doing Uber Eats and carry around food until someone near them orders it. So the way Uber Eats works is they put the food in the car, then people order it, then they deliver it. So a lot of the food's already in the car nearby, and what they've been able to do is optimize how to have food super fresh nearby places that are most likely to want it. See the wrap-up sign, sorry.
Do you have a question in the back before we?
Sorry. Maybe I'll ask you personally afterwards.
Thanks for the small and spirited conversation. Good job, everybody. Thanks, guys. That was fun.
That scares me about Uber. I haven't used that service, but now I am not going to use that service.
If the USDA food safety day is
I have a pretty high degree of confidence in Uber's ability to get legal things like regulations right.
So they just load up like 10 chicken burritos from Chipotle and wait till someone.
I think very few, and like if there's anything Uber's good at, it's matching supply and demand super fast. So like
I would
have
love
a pretty
search
high
pricing for
degree.
food and order my food at like 2 in the afternoon.
Yeah, and like they have like little ovens in the car, like little like warmer sort of things.
Oh, okay, that
So,
makes
like,
me. I just thought it was like in the back of some guy's
No,
like.
it's not like
yes, like.
It's not like someone ordered a hoagie. Did I put that in the glove box? Or,
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, Uber's on top of all of this stuff. I feel like they're having quiet conversations with like everybody right now.
Absolutely.
And not a lot is public yet, but I feel like there's like senses for everything.
They're doing a lot of really interesting like infrastructure planning partnerships where like the city of Boston can't really understand how people drive and where they drive because they can't track every single car because that'd be terrifying. But so Uber's like so in kind of exchange for letting Uber do business, they're like, okay, just like turn
If
over
you let us operate in your city and don't shut us down, we'll give you all
and
this
like
data.
it's free data for them. It's anonymized and they get like much more insights into like where people actually go from like the beginning of their journey to the end, because like they can track public transportation, but you're just going from stop A to stop B when like your office is here and like your house is here. You can't like figure out the other parts of the journey. That's fair. I like Uber. Actually gonna Uber home. It's gonna be like
The tax imposed on Uber for Boston Logan is absurd, though. It's like it's like 33% of my.
Well, that's just if you're taking Uber to leave the airport, right?
No.
Oh, really?
Wait. No, it is pickup. It's pickup only.
Yeah. Because how would they know?
Well,
just drop me off.
Uber
Do you have a card so I can
They don't have
email
to say
you
that.
when we actually have the API?
Yeah, because like
actually,
I'm super interested in trying to figure out
You guys are
how.
all on EMS together, but sure.
Oh yeah. Never mind.
I mean, do what you need to do.
I actually ran out of
You
this is
all
my
have
last
each
batch,
other's
so
contact info anyway.
I'm keeping those.
Excellent. Thank you.
Especially
I'll
because
take one.
like when someone posts something isn't necessarily like
Well,
when they
so-
post it in the like timeline is terrifying, but if we have
And
some data, it's better than nothing.
Our
to try to work
guidance
from.
is from date. The majority of it is from date of purchase, so it doesn't really apply from like when it says it's expiring or whatever. Like it's just about when the consumer takes it home. If you buy a steak that says sell by October 14th, you could still have it in your fridge for 5 days.
I didn't know that about me. Like, so I grew up in Iowa. My parents are farmers, so like the crop thing, like they measure like the tinge of crops from the air to figure out, try to do long-term predictions and stuff. Like they're on top of it with like tech data. It's crazy.
Precision agriculture is like probably one of the most like tech industries there is.
It's amazing, isn't it? What do a bunch of farmers know? Well, quite a bit.
Yeah.
It's like a shitload of money.
like us.
I plan on keeping the farms in the family as long as possible.
Keep a good investment, not keep chicken in your food.
So our guidance is it's conservative because it's for everyone. When you think about older people are more at risk of foodborne illness, babies, people with cancer, diabetes, basically more than half the population is in some at-risk.
So it's like a worst case scenario.
Yeah, so I mean, for a healthy adult, I would not recommend that you eat chicken you've had in the fridge for 5 days, but you are less likely to get sick than an individual that has diabetes or an individual that is on some sort of autoimmune treatment. That being said, I have become much more conservative in the 2 years that I worked for FSIS. Some of those illnesses are super horrible, and I end up talking to a lot of constituents whose children died from those illnesses. So, you know, my husband and I.
What states are?
So some states have already passed something, so I'm not sure if they'll probably reconsider, but I don't know if I don't know if it's been yet. Thanks so much for coming over, Chris. That was a lot of fun. We'll be in touch. I don't even remember, but we'll be in touch for sure in the future because I want to keep thinking about this, and you're in the perfect nexus of government data and food, so you and I are becoming friends.
Excellent.
But thanks for coming out here.
It was good to meet you all. Cheers.
Actually, that's true. Wait, can I take a picture of the panelists? And put it on Twitter?
Do you take it with you?
Feed America does like
Yeah.
an auction system still, right? For like locations.
Actually, they just switched up the guys like in the past couple of minutes. But yeah, I've never used the Twitter system, it's somebody else that you, but I can't imagine all of us might steal Twitter tags.
Sorry. Did you say like McDonald's on fire or something? Don't actually do that. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, John Oliver is good, right? I mean, he's ridiculous. So questions that happen too.
By the way, I started interrupting the implementation of the technology stuff. I just think what doesn't matter for us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, but I don't really understand how that thing.
Yeah,
I mean, it really gives me.
they've also just made the decision that even if it is a legal liability, that it's worth it. You know, like.
Maybe, I doubt it. They are pretty good at covering their asses.
Yeah, but
They're pretty big names in insurance.
yeah, but you got like do like ridiculous ones.
We do.
You guys are.
We personally do.
You got
I think the happy hours is fine.
Yes.
So I would. How did you go to that? So question on that. Typically, it relies on each individual person knowing their own. Like it's a market, right? Each individual actually makes those decisions themselves. How does it? Is that going to go by the wayside if they collect better collection data to centralized locations that use it to deciding what all these locations should receive?
So you seem like conflicting right strategies.
Like an individual? You know, like, I know John, yeah.
There's a tab. I'm like,
I think 85%
Did you order like, or double whiskeys or what?
Mostly beer. I kept it together. We gotta find out here.
So it's not one pool of food.
No, so we get purchase food, we purchase food directly, we get a lot of.
I still part of this one.
And then we go,
Why are you setting
farm
stuff?
stuff, individual
This is
customers,
usual.
it's a whole.
Oh,
That doesn't go into
yeah.
one pile, why not?
That makes sense.
Why bifurcate it?
Well, it does like, we distribute it basically the same way, and different types of food have different regulations. Too, so like, government food, for example, we have.
It's pretty good, you know, they're fruit. I got the orange and the strawberry.
I got a lemon one, which I liked, and I want to just not getting a lemon one again.
Literati.
Purchase products, whole name, more expensive because we have.
Well, I bet you this is not costs. I bet you this is not random.
So you do food and
But it all ends up in the same.
do you have other issues that you?
Yeah.
Yeah. They're getting all the dishes that no one.
You know, the original question, if you guys are collecting lots of like costs and data on like
With the work that
actually is at the individual level, what's to
You know, I talk about connecting it more effectively to like other, like
sure for the
for
person
other
like
rights that aren't
you're saying whatever level.
the civil and political
What's
rights, like
how do you reassure the
healthcare
country
and
that you're not going to assert their ability to claim what they need?
and just like those broader set of issues that.
Like if you're like jumping them basically in terms of like data collection.
Yeah.
I mean, because there are
In terms
a lot of
information
security
about what's
issues
available when and where it needs to be.
Totally.
You're
I was just
constantly
thinking through all the
bridge
information
between them and like demand.
It's fun because they were talking, like, we did a plenty calls so they could review each other already, which really helps, but like, so much of the work that I do, like,
Yeah,
people
yes,
are like,
yes. So like if I'm a food pantry operator, the status quo I get to log
and then
in,
like 3 years from now,
I
I really think it's
but-
gonna be bring them all this shit,
uh,
like, yeah, people are gonna be like, wait,
But at
this
least
is
I
bad,
can make that
because
decision based on my knowledge and my.
there's so much information.
And then they'll tell you
Yeah,
thoughts.
just one section.
Yeah, they will.
And
Travis
Travis
knows all my stuff, and he wants to do a good job.
He's a fanboy.
No matter what.
Yeah, that's my job. I have to tell her that I asked you to break down no matter what happens.
Exactly.
You did a good job. Nicely done. Yeah. The other day, I should forget the cool stuff. Yelp had this giant party at Dr. Breakout.
They do some things with that.
Yeah, that was cool. They serve like
Great donations.
food from the highest Yelp places. I think they'd be obligated.
Probably the Yelp has like a whole weird thing with their like star reviewers. The Yelp Elite.
Oh.
The Yelp Elite, you get previews of restaurants. Yeah, it's like
That's a little bit.
I think
A little bit.
Yeah.
Right? Amazon does the same thing with
Yes.
their products to their
The elite. I think if there's not a documentary about being an elite reviewer, there's pretty exciting.
There was a I forget which podcast was talking about like some Amazon. Yeah, I don't know if anyone said this.
They should try that.
Yeah, I'm going to plan it on YouTube.
And I have to go back to CDT because I have to like, I'm leaving town.
But, you know, data changed.
Oh, yeah.
There's just enough data.
Right, exactly. We have such strong control over a lot of our products. I'll start talking about.
Oh, yeah, you guys are
You know, seeing.
But yeah, we blew our travel budget. So we're grounded for now.
Thank you guys so much.
I think I got together this was easy. Early in the year, and then the rest of the year. Trying to go to California for weeks ago. I couldn't get up there.
I mean, they had the bigger.
You're not going home.
Yeah.
Going back to this area.
I mean, I'll just, it's like 45
So basically every
Yeah, right?
DC besides the
Thanks for
like the worst that happens.
Well done.
pulling up signs.
Yep.
I'll
Sure,
just
tell
like
me
Geo
again.
Mart, and then I'm gonna,
Interesting,
and then I'm
Yeah,
gonna,
and then we tend to, I'm not sure exactly what our threshold is, but we usually say it's like half a truckload or something. It's less than that, but it's, you know, a certain amount of threshold, otherwise we try to connect partners. So I would imagine a lot of this stuff, and also we,
In that case, it's probably blue.
yeah, and also we say, we don't take.
Sit down and do it.
I think people just don't click the code.
Okay.
That's the beauty of it. You self-select.
Well, listen, I mean, it's been years since we've chatted, so I'm definitely, I mean, I'm one of the people on the first barrier, so I'll definitely take a look, but it sounds like something should work.
Yeah, we definitely don't like distribution sites that are probably to get your ration. But maybe more sodium.
Yeah, absolutely.
We got a lot of people that have low sodium as an option. The co-founders of the
very in tune with all the health measures.
And is it an option on your side? If we bid on it, is it automatically ours, like we're the first components to ask for?
Yep.
Alright.
I mean, it's up to you to get it, but
We got some, it's like, still 11 trips.
and I think part of so like once in a while, there will be you guys compete with me, say, yes, on a very conceptual level, we both distribute food. But right, exactly. But like from that perspective, we also compete with like the AARP volunteers who just drive food around. But more importantly, like to answer their like, wait, we like peanut butter, why don't we do this for you? Things like lobbying, so fantastic like data analysis stuff. Like we still rely on you guys to like lead on some data sets for sure. Like mostly what we found that XKCD. So we've seen the one that's a heat map. It's like this is a heat map of where internet users are. This is a heat map of people that are like on the studio. This is a heat map. And the guy's like, the implications are obvious. And all the exact same map is like pet peeve, heat maps that are based on just
I was gonna say, you have to sit in the center.
population maps.
Nope, I'm not sitting in the center.
That's kind of what we're finding so far between like food insecurity and like.
Am I? Oh, I'm sorry. No.
Keep up this funny, this is not.
Yeah.
Just want to keep that. People are so excited about it, which I find a little annoying because we don't make it out forever, right? It's in a new field.
I have like 18-inch legs.
We gotta get one.
Is that see?
Yeah.
I'm all for trans.
Okay, so. Yeah, also.
I dare you say that.
Also, I heard we made fun of that.
They're like,
Okay.
yeah, this is the first place I've been to that has a misspelled my name. I have no idea how people. Play Freebird.
Is this where I get to make a comment about assumptions about women's technology?
If you want to.
No, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm just gonna cross it out really big and put the A.
No shit. I was actually going to make a comment about like gender equality and going for trans and whatnot. But if you want to correct it that way, it's. I mean, it's like
Happens.
Ooh, I got painted that. Well, the Red Bull's there for a reason. I went from
Just because of that.
I went from Google, where I had nothing but coffees.
Sorry, what were you saying?
So I went from Google, where I have my cup of coffee before I make the drive into the office.
Yeah.
I walk over to the coffee lab to go, then have my cup of coffee there, have breakfast, go downstairs to the barista.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem.
No, the Google cafeteria is a beautiful thing. It's really lovely.
You might want to turn those other mics that way. Away from
Off?
you. No, or off or away from you.
Yeah. Are you suggesting that I'm a loud individual?
I believe it.
I do like how they
Don't mind us, we're almost ready.
All right.
The last session of the day, a little slap happy, the caffeine's been flowing,
No.
both for us and you. Stay in the lines.
Never. Seriously, ever since I was little, I have never been able to color in the lines. Like to the point where my parents did my coloring for me. Because I was great at them colored. All right.
There you go. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. No, you can't leave.
I'm seeing if they need help on the mics there, but if not.
Ready?
Whenever you are, sir.
All right, hello, folks. Welcome to the last session of the this track, and I think at the conference. So, thanks for sticking around for the afternoon. Try to keep this a very lively and informative discussion and debate. I think you will not be disappointed. We have a very illustrious rogues gallery up here. And I'd like to also welcome those of you who are watching remotely. I think you'll also find this a very interesting and informative session as well. So my name is Dr. Rick Forno. I am the director of the Graduate Cybersecurity Program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County.
I'm also the assistant director of our Center for Cybersecurity. I came to UMBC after 20 years in the industry, mostly in an operational role in network security, network operations. Also had a strong policy bent, moved in academia, and basically want to give back and kind of share the lessons learned to help educate the next generation in terms of not making the same mistakes we did. With me on the panel here as well is another fine academic, Professor Andrea Matuishin. I always butcher your name, I apologize.
No, that's fine.
Professor of Law at Northeastern University, and was the former senior
policy advisor.
Former senior policy advisor at the Federal Trade Commission, where she just looked into cybersecurity and consumer protection type of stuff, and she may touch on some of those later today as well. At the far left, or my left, your right, is Pat McDonald. Pat has a long career in cybersecurity operations as well. He's been a security engineer. He's been a NOC manager. He's been a security manager, and he's now a technical programs manager at Google, where he's looking at various privacy solutions. So the way this talk today is going to flow is, we heard earlier, is anybody in that talk this morning about information sharing? The first session was in this room before lunch. Okay, we're going to build on that talk. In particular, that looked at information sharing broadly at a very policy high level. And what we're looking to do here in this session is drill down a little bit into some of the operational and practical realities of information sharing, particularly vulnerability disclosure of security vulnerabilities and cyber risk. But underscoring our comments today and the discussion with you is that many of these same items transcend into other disciplines, whether it's chemical plant security, any industry involving risk. Okay, there are questions of risk communication and risk disclosure. But this panel, again, is going to focus on cybersecurity risks, but just bear in mind that a lot of these things do transfer into other disciplines and industries as well. So to kind of set the panel up, I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about the issue at hand of vulnerability disclosure. This is one of the perennial debates, very polarizing in many ways, in the security industry, going back 20 years or longer. And what it really comes down to is how much information about a security problem should be told, under what conditions, to whom, and when. And this debate has really become distilled into three general concepts. The idea of full disclosure, meaning I'm a security researcher or a vendor, I've discovered a problem in a product or service, I'm going to tell the world everything there is to know about this vulnerability. Maybe release some code showing how it works, what we call proof of concept. And if somebody takes that and weaponizes it, oh well, I just want to get the word out there. That's what we call full disclosure. At the other end of the spectrum is what we've come to term responsible disclosure, or the sense that the researchers or those who find vulnerabilities and exploits will first work with the affected product vendor to determine the scope and severity and impact, and let the vendor investigate and possibly develop a fix in a timely manner before the researcher then discloses it. Some have argued this is almost akin to blackmailing. We're going to report it to you, and if you don't respond within 30 days, we're going to tell the world. Consequences be damned. That's another option. But some vendors have taken a very proactive and responsible view of responsible disclosure, and will work with researchers to ensure that their interests are met in keeping the vendors informed, and the public is kept informed of vulnerabilities as they're discovered and remedied. And many companies have what they call responsible disclosure policies governing how these actions take place. So you have these two extremes. And in the middle is the responsible disclosures. Full disclosure, zero disclosure. As the name implies, we're not going to tell anybody anything. I've discovered a vulnerability, we're to keep it to ourselves. Or I'm going to only tell the vendor in question, and if they disclose it, that's up to them. Keeping it very secret. And there are advocates and opponents in all three of these categories, and this issue, as I said, it's going on for 20 years, has yet to be resolved. 9/11 brought this idea of information sharing again to the forefront, after the terrorist attacks in a big way. Things like outages of cellular phone networks were suddenly kept secret because the government did not want, and phone companies did not want terrorists to know, well, the scope of a cell outage in a certain town, because that might help them plan attacks. Chemical plants were removed, the location of nuclear power plants were removed from public reading rooms and maps. I thought that was kind of funny. How do you remove a nuclear power plant from public knowledge? You can drive along the road and see a sign that says power plant next right, see the cooling towers, but it's not on the map. Well, a terrorist is going to find a way to find out where the power plant is, even if it's not on the map. So the issue of vulnerability disclosure and, broadly speaking, security disclosure, risk communication, came back in a big way in 9/11. But the underlying question is, does this really work? Well, my colleague at the Stanford Center for Internet and Society, Jennifer Granick, coined the term, this can create the possibility of a cybersecurity 1%, where we have a select group of individuals or companies that know all the vulnerabilities, and those end users and smaller businesses who are not part of that 1% are kept in the dark or have very limited awareness as to what's going on. And that has the problem of creating some issues of trust and bad blood and operational problems in the internet industry, generally speaking. So this morning's panel talked about information sharing and how can we facilitate government and private sector to share information about cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And I asked a good friend of mine who's been very involved in cybersecurity vulnerability research for years, Brian Martin, about this. And one of his comments to me was, well, when chinchillas are outlawed, only outlaws will have chinchillas. Meaning that if we suddenly keep all the vulnerabilities secret and we develop policies and processes that keep information under wraps, then the only people who have this information will be outlaws, and this information becomes criminalized. The problem is information is fungible, and information on the internet in this day and age is not easily constrained. So even though you believe you're keeping a security vulnerability private within a certain group or a cartel or a public-private partnership, there's no guarantee with certainty that that information will not get out through other means, or that somebody else somewhere in the world is not going to discover the same vulnerability. So then you've got two distinct paths here, where on one hand, there are those who believe that vulnerability sharing of cybersecurity information can be constrained in a way that only helps the good guys and keeps information out of the hands of the bad guys. But by contrast, that's not a guarantee. As we heard this morning, one of the problems with vulnerability disclosure and information sharing is that this seems to be the preferred solution. Over years, whenever there's been a security incident, and we've had many in recent years, the first go-to action is, let's go ahead and create some more ways of sharing information. Because sharing information will be the answer. If we can exchange vulnerability information privately, that'll help. And it may, but it also may not. This goes back to at least the mid-90s. And we see that this every couple of years, these solutions are presented repeatedly. The question that we have to face as a society, and a democratic society, is that where does cybersecurity vulnerability disclosure draw the line between maintaining security and having that balance of keeping security awareness and maintaining security in practice? Depending on who you talk to, you're going to get folks at either end of the extreme who believe that all information should be disclosed, or those who say information should be totally restricted. The problem is, and I'm quoting someone who wrote one of the most popular network security programs in recent times. He says he doesn't have the stamina to further debate disclosure processes or the ethics of disclosing vulnerabilities anymore. We've been doing this fruitlessly for decades. I'm happy enough with the status quo, which is very little regulation of the process. Sure, I can think of regulations that might help force better behavior by vendors, but I think any new regulations are more likely to make things worse by censoring security researchers, independent researchers. He also added that there is this perception that information, again, should be kept quiet, kept secret, versus letting, again, going back to the idea of zero disclosure versus full disclosure. The bottom line he argues is when we talk about vulnerability disclosure, who are regulations or processes likely to help? And we need to bear that in mind, whether it's going to help the internet community generally, or is it skewed towards business interests? In the panel this morning and some of our comments today, we'll talk about some of those initiatives and how they do skew the discussion and the benefits more towards commercial interests than true operational security enhancements. So I'll leave it there as for now as a way of just kind of kicking off the discussion to kind of illustrate the high-level issues that we're facing in the security industry. Whether you're an independent researcher, a security engineer at a company, a government person, this affects various levels of the industry, but brings in issues of civil liberties, privacy, censorship, freedom of speech, the nature of information and knowledge. There are so many angles of this that in some ways it's not surprising why there is yet 20 years on no clear-cut answer to what is the best or preferred way of dealing with vulnerability disclosure in cyberspace. We'll have some more things to say about this later on, but I want to turn the floor over to Patrick, to kind of come at this from his view in the operational world of vulnerability disclosure, where he's actually done vulnerability research and gone through these procedures.
Okay, so you can tell I'm the operations guy because I'm the only one with a can of Red Bull at the table. I apologize if I butcher names. I'm worse than Rick at that. So my first introduction to the responsible disclosure, full disclosure, such debate came back in the end of 2001, 2002, when Matt Conover of the Woo Woo Group released an AOL bug right on Christmas. And the much younger me went on a very fiery rant because I couldn't believe that people were mad at a researcher publishing information that would help people to protect their system. Now, I wish that younger me had the older me to be able to go ahead and describe much better what I was feeling, how I felt. But as an operations guy, you spend numerous evenings, for lack of a better term, on the wall, watching the hordes trying to break in, trying to prevent the people you're protecting from opening the door and inviting the hordes in. And you do this in the dark, completely in the dark. So any information that we could receive, wherever it comes from, whether it's a very poorly written, hey, I found the bug in such and such, so at least I know where to be looking for a new attack. Or, hey, this is completely vulnerable, here's the POC, I can test the POC, I can prove it, and I know there's not a patch, I shut off services. In my role as a network and security manager, I took advantage of, with the latest OpenSSL vulnerabilities before patches were released, of maintenance windows where I told customers, yes, we're going down for maintenance, took those services offline, not because we were doing maintenance, because it reduced my attack surface and lowered the window of exposure until a patch came out. So Rick talked about my experience in doing vulnerability research. And as an advocate for researchers and them being able to disclose, one of the things I repeatedly got told, both in my work as a government contractor and then my work in the private sector, was a lot of vendors believe that their product is a unique special snowflake. When combined with this unique special snowflake of a researcher, that was the only way the problem would be discovered. It was this magical combination. And so if we could censor the researcher, the problem would never be rediscovered again. Well, I hate to disappoint them that doesn't be the case. In my work with the OSVBD, as I was mangling vulnerabilities, going ahead and adding the information to create a robust vulnerability database, you saw tons of emails on SecOps lists, on full disclosure and such, that listed different people finding the exact same vulnerability through different paths at relatively the same time. About 10% of the entries that I mangled, and I mangled thousands, had this case. Now, I had some insight into it a little bit more as I came to work the vulnerability disclosure programs for C2FO. We did both HackerOne and BugCrowd, and we would get multiple submissions coming with POCs. Interestingly enough, some of these POCs actually included from different researchers the exact same.
Can you clarify what a POC is for those?
Sorry, proof of concept. The idea here is to demonstrate that not only is the vulnerability real, but it's exploitable, so that somebody outside the network can actually use this to create the effect that they claim. We found POCs that contain the exact same MD5 checksum. So even if the researcher is a special and unique snowflake, they're sharing this information with their fellow researchers and friends, who are then also sharing it with us. So even if, as a vendor, you could censor the researcher, it's already been shared. It's already out on markets that are completely unavailable and accessible for us to contain. So looking at and going ahead and following up, Dan Gilmore brought it up in the information sharing question. What incentives do we want to place out there for researchers? Well, the incentives that I see and most associate with are not good. We had Dimitri's arrest at DEF CON 9. We had Weave, the AT&T hacker, who apparently AT&T doesn't realize that simple addition is a very easy way and skill available to all of us. When I moved out to Kansas City, the first OWASP KC meeting I attended, Steve Jensen was speaking about application security. And he referenced that on a return flight home, his flight got canceled, and so he had to make a change to his reservation. On his reservation, he found a vulnerability in a, won't mention the airline, but it was Denver, so you can go ahead and take your guesses, that they had a vulnerability in their mobile web app. Steve did the most responsible thing I could think of, immediately called and began to try to talk and say, I found a security issue with your system. Rather than being met with open arms, an appropriate redirect to maybe the right department, or a, hey sir, here is our process on how to submit these issues, he was met with attacks of lawsuit. He was met with attacks of fines, censure, and everything else. We can even go through into our own industry, the security industry, just recently with Jean-Marie Bourbon and FireEye, where Jean-Marie went ahead and posted security issues with the FireEye security product. Here is a vendor that makes its living off of security disclosures by other researchers to provide signatures, to provide understanding of what attacks are out there. FireEye went ahead and contacted the researcher's company and censured the researcher by getting them fired from their profession. And lastly, we have good old Oracle. Mary Ann Davidson, the CISO for Oracle, went on a rant that is best enjoyed with a tall glass of alcohol and a large sense of humor, that they didn't need researchers examining their products for security vulnerabilities. I'm going to read a Bruce Schreiner quote, which I think sums it up very, very nicely. It's easy to just mock Davidson's stance, but it's dangerous to our community. Yes, if researchers don't find vulnerabilities in Oracle products, then the company won't look bad, won't have to patch things, but the real attackers, whether they be government, criminals, or cyber arms weapon manufacturers who sell to government and criminals, will continue to find vulnerabilities in her products. And while they won't make a press splash and embarrass her, they will exploit them. The only thing I can think to say to Ms. Davidson is that as somebody who used to mangle for OSVBD and deal with the quarterly Oracle reports, is I wish she had come out with this announcement much, much earlier and would have saved me many hours. Now, not all disclosure programs, not all vendors are villainous towards researchers. Kimberly Price, who runs BugCrowd, which goes ahead and does security disclosure for a lot of companies, gave a great talk at Black Hat and brought up something that I think is very, very important, that if nothing else, if you provide no monetary reward, if you provide no material award of, hey, here's a cool t-shirt to wear, swag, or even a Hall of Fame award, the best thing that you provide with those programs to researchers is a social contract that says, I won't sue you. Just the fact that you promise not to litigate an attack goes ahead and allows these researchers to come up from the underground where they are going to either sell to the highest bidder, or as Rick said, I'm going to keep it and exploit it and run around with it until somebody else finds it and closes it, and allows them a venue where they feel safe. It doesn't have to be a cash reward. I worked for a company that went ahead and ran 2 programs. I could never convince my superiors to go ahead and shell out the cash for it, as I worked in one-man security office. But most of these researchers simply want a kudos so that they can take it and establish a portfolio so they can then go ahead and show a future employer, you want proof that I understand security, application security outside of the theoretical, I know to patch my systems, etc. Here's my Hall of Fame report for this vendor. Here you can see that I understand cross-site scripting because I found it in this application. It's publicly available. It's a great portfolio. You have vendors, Brian Carter, a good friend of mine, works very extensively in bug bounty programs. Found one on a shopping cart site that he frequents, reported it to the vendor. Vendor gave him a 5% coupon. Didn't cost the vendor anything other than maybe a couple cents on the dollar, and they got a several $1,000 bug closed. You have security teams that find employees. Facebook posted back in August of 2013 that they had 2 direct hires from their bug bounty program. As a security researcher, as a person who's run CISO-style duties for a company, it's painful not to have this research, particularly in the public. It's painful not to be able to leverage this research. BugCrowd offers a fantastic way to do that, and that they encourage these researchers to participate as part of their Flex program. The idea here is rather than having a single point in time penetration test, you take their certified body of researchers, you pay out a particular amount of cash, and it's a free-for-all. Whoever finds the best vulnerability wins the payout, and you can have a tiered structure. And from there, they go ahead and divvy out, they do all the attrition for you. To give you an idea, NetSecret posted on Twitter as part of his SecretConf talk, we weren't sure on a bug bounty program. We spent $200,000 on pen testing, found 11 vulnerabilities. $48,000 on a bug bounty, 66. Chris Trainer, who is a sales rep for BugCrowd, when he was convincing me about the program, had me talk to Joshua Lund. Joshua works for a company that already goes ahead and publicly posts the result of their penetration test, gave the Flex program, the responsible disclosure program on BugCrowd, a try. They went from 6 vulnerabilities found in their pen test, and we'll say that the pen test was a little lacking on what it found 9 times those vulnerabilities with a 2-week Flex program test. So you have the ability here to leverage an incredible amount of people from locale who speak different languages, who don't necessarily use a system in the same way your researchers or your staff would, that bring a great amount to the table. And vendors, not all of them, but most of them are doing everything they can to drive them to the ground, whether through their own legislative practices or through government legislation, which they're going ahead and manipulating and leveraging to go ahead and continue to drive these guys underground.
So you can get a sense here that there is still 20 years on the debate is raging in the security community, but then it also does trickle more broadly as far as cybersecurity issues fitting into national security, public safety, and security considerations as well. That may explain why vendors are in some ways heavy-handed towards lobbying lawsuits and after researchers. I mean, I'm sort of proud to have been accused of one myself. I have got a DMCA takedown notice about a Cisco vulnerability on my wall at the home office. It's a mark of honor, okay? But the word still got out, even though it was removed. This was removed from the internet. The word still got out. How much easier would that vulnerability have been resolved under a different set of circumstances and different processes that worked with researchers instead of treating them as the enemy because the information was deemed proprietary? I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, so following up on those themes, if I may, I'd like to take us forward with a laundry list of some thoughts for possible methods for improving the current situation as I see it from both a public and private sector perspective. So the first kind of big picture point that I'd like to share with you is that focusing on vulnerability disclosure processes in isolation of the big picture of information security issues will unfortunately lead us to a suboptimal conclusion. It's really a system of moving pieces that all need to be addressed in tandem. One of the most important points that is a linchpin of this system is the concept of leading by example, both in the private and the public sector. There are many things that are common in the information security challenges that both public and private sector entities face. And so working internally to get oneself up to speed and be the secure organization that you're hoping to see elsewhere is the first step of this. To that end, we see sometimes conflicting definitions of what good security means, not only in the private sector, but also in the public sector. If you look at the way that certain agencies operationalize their self-defined mission in context, there can be some tensions. I might point us to the recent encryption backdoor conversation, where in the name of security, there were different operationalized paradigms at play that sometimes directly conflicted. And so depending on which agency you talk to, you might get a different analysis of the desirability of those programs. Creating a common language, both in the public sector and across the public and private sector together, is the first baby step we have to get to, or everything else will fall in on itself later, unfortunately. The second baby step is learning to assess risk accurately through perspective taking, which is something that the most sophisticated security professionals have certainly been doing, and we've been hearing some of that. So thinking about how attackers view your organization, whether it's public or private sector, and creating internal structures for reporting and correcting known issues. We all want to improve. We want to build better products. We want to provide private sector or public sector services more efficiently, right? So creating feedback loops in the ways that we see, for example, the new ISO standards on security, articulating some of the best practices of what sophisticated organizations do, that's the next step. And that has to come from the top. In the private sector, it's the C-suite in the private sector that needs to dig in and address those issues and secure things top down by making it an organizational priority. Same thing in the public sector, top down organizational priority. For concrete suggestions and self-assessment, I might point us all to the new FTC Start with Security document, which has a list of 10 very basic questions that go to the question of whether an organization has reasonable security measures in place. It's just a starting point for this conversation, but unfortunately, many organizations can't answer yes to all of those 10 questions, and that's a great place to start. So building structures, both organizational and product structures, in better ways involves technology suitability, knowing who your users are and knowing who your customers are. So I call this partially a better with bacon problem. Sometimes we think that by incorporating a new technology or a new bonus functionality onto an old technology, we inherently have made it better, the same way that an overzealous chef might sprinkle stuffed bacon on all the things on the table. But the problem is, if you're dining with a vegetarian, that means the meal's been destroyed for that person, right? So it's about thinking through what actually makes things work better for all the constituents in this conversation, all the stakeholders, if you will. So more connectivity is not always better. And security pros will tell you that in many cases you want to engage with things like air gaps and setting aside data protected from connectivity. That might not be the intuitive move from the standpoint of someone who's trying to create organizational efficiency and make all those searches of the 28 years of employee data faster. But perspective taking, 28 or more years of data in a single database for your employees, makes you a very attractive target for compromise, right? So more connectivity, not always better. And usability is a piece of this. Do the people who are interacting day to day with the technology understand how the technology works and what the risk profile is? And one really potent lever that we can use here is the power of government procurement. So updating procurement standards to incorporate security concerns in a meaningful way would nudge the market to generate higher quality products that are more secure out of the box and interact with users in a more intuitive way. And that then brings us to the theme of the disclosure conversation around meaningful information sharing. So that's the linchpin of the to-date paradigms that we're trying to leverage in DC for the most part. But the challenge is that we risk putting the cart before the horse if the necessary pre-existing structures aren't in place. So what does this mean? It means fixing pre-existing flaws in what we have today. One type of flaw that we have today is a lack of security metrics driven by a lack of coordinated processes around the format. So this is a formatting issue. It's like the memo that you're writing for your law firm or the specs that you're writing for your product. A formatting issue around security advisories. We don't have a handle on how vulnerable we are across the private sector or the public sector because security advisories are frequently not written in an optimally usable way. So to allow for metrics to be created around the reality of our vulnerability and our disclosure processes and our fixing of existing flaws, one of the first steps is to have a conversation around the drafting and the presentation of security advisory information. Without meaningful security advisory information being shared when vulnerabilities are found, the vulnerability aggregators can't aggregate and push out that information to allow for other people to get access to that information and meaningfully patch their systems. So it's all interconnected, right? And one of the key elements that I've heard from aggregators is a problem is an inadequate identification of embedded libraries in vulnerable products and when vulnerabilities impact libraries. And so this is one possible goal for the current NTIA disclosure process that we're in the middle of. I think it would be a fascinating and potentially manageable goal to talk through the optimal format of presenting security advisories after a code creator has identified and acknowledged that there is a flaw that they are in the process of fixing. So the communication in a standardized way to allow for information sharing and aggregation. So I think that's a low-level, uncontroversial, well, for me, uncontroversial step that would greatly facilitate our more sophisticated conversations in these ways. In particular, I'm highlighting this because the inevitable burgeoning of IoT vulnerabilities, when the Internet of Things really permeates our society thoroughly, the current structures for vulnerability reporting, the CVE system and others, will have a very difficult time scaling. So we need to start experimenting with thinking about these scaling problems for a different kind of society that we're building that is very technologically connected with pervasive vulnerabilities, because IoT vulns, it's the high-end technology product vulns kind of ratcheted back 10 years, right? Because there are no screens. It's hard to run any kind of app on them to look for existing viruses or anything by the consumer. So it's really about building well on the front end, and yet these are entrepreneurs who are sometimes operating on shoestring budgets too. So the IoT space presents a lot of complicated issues, but around the question of disclosure, I think it's important for us to recognize that without creating good structures, we're not going to be able to scale successfully for the challenges that the IoT explosion presents to us. So this is really about creating meaningful feedback loops, and security research is one of those meaningful feedback loops for vendors and for our society. As our physical safety increasingly relies on code in our cars, in our medical devices, et cetera, we need to have structures in place to create consumer confidence in these products and to offer, for the good of our society and our economy, the highest quality products possible, especially when we can find flaws in the code. We all hopefully want to make them better, right? So the legal regimes that in particular would hopefully engage with and perhaps evolve to address some of the currently challenged feedback loops that we have include the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and we're currently in the middle of a triennial rulemaking process, and the Copyright Office and Librarian of Congress are considering exemptions that include specific security research requests. Full disclosure, I'm the lawyer in class 25, which is security research exemption. And so having the legal toolkit that is sometimes leveraged to aggressively silence the researchers that we, the grand we being all of us as consumers of technology, would want to hear from and would want to facilitate our feedback loops, closing down the opportunities for strike suits and strategic litigation to silence researchers. That's a part of the creation of this meaningful feedback loop process. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, troubled statute that we're all undoubtedly familiar with, 3 circuit splits in the federal appellate courts on this statute written in 1986. The world is very different from when it was in 1986. And so Congress did the best it could in 1986, same way it did the best it could with the DMCA, but it's time for us to examine the emergent consequences of technology nudging these statutes into the society that we have now and where we want to take it going forward. A component of this may be, for example, around mitigating the CFAA uncertainty that we currently have, centralization of CFAA prosecutions in DOJ rather than leaving discretion to individual prosecutors throughout the country. That would help to give a coherent approach to the DOJ position on CFAA prosecutions, and greater transparency in making indictments more readily findable for researchers to be able to get counsel from their attorneys as to whether the conduct that they are potentially engaging in may be perceived in their jurisdiction to violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So empowering attorneys to be involved in this cycle is part of what's missing as well. So these are some of the feedback loops that will help to create not only product improvements, but also structural improvements in both the public and the private sector. Other ways that we haven't tried to create good incentives, for example, particularly with the challenges that we're going to face in security vulnerability in IoT products, phased out tax incentives for entrepreneurs to get them up to speed with security. It's something that would be hopefully a win-win in terms of both consumer protection, providing higher quality, neat gizmos in the marketplace, and making us all less vulnerable in the process. Creating tools to help both public and private sector entities do supply chain integrity assessments, figuring out where your vulnerabilities really lie and whether embedded products that you are getting from other places may expose you to unintended or unanticipated risks. That could be a technology assisted solution or something that the agencies that are involved with data security could assist the self-assessment process, both in the public and private sector, through some guidance documents working with experts, for example. In addition to those, and I don't want to take up too much time. How much time do we have? Okay, so here's just a few other thoughts for us to discuss. The SEC has started to engage in more evaluation of its October 2011 guidance around material disclosures of incidents. The approach of additional disclosure I'm a fan of because, full disclosure, I wrote an article advocating that 7 years earlier. So I think they're going to continue to engage because investors care about these issues, and I've had hedge funds and others come up to me and say, how do I factor in vulnerability in my assessment of the risk profiles of the companies that we're investing in? So there's interest in the market and on the street in this. Other things I'd like to see, a technology solution to data breach notification. I think an aggregation database would go a long way in that space. I'm not sure we need a legal solution necessarily as a first cut. I think a nice database to eliminate inequality of information about breaches across jurisdictions would go a long way. Limitations of liability, it's too soon. It's going to create the wrong incentives to limit liability. No, we shouldn't do it. And the last point, and this is something that I think a lot about, and I'm working on a book on it, we need to realize that sometimes natural tinkering of, for example, children with technology may look on its face, that conduct may look on its face as if it is an act of DMCA circumvention or an act of CFAA unauthorized access. But we want to encourage our kids to tinker and innovate, and they are surveilled in ways that last generation of tinkering kids were not surveilled. And so we have a little bit of a collision course here happening between encouraging our kids to tinker and innovate and increased surveillance by the gadgets themselves of what is happening to them. And so if we want to build a next generation workforce, particularly in security spaces, we need to create a safer environment for kids to learn about these processes. And so having alternative punishment structures that give judges flexibility to assess what the intent was behind the tinkering is a component of this. Having, for example, felony-only CFAA convictions will kill much of the next generation of the tinkering children, and that's not good for our innovation economy, even if, in the opinion of some legislators, it may act as a deterrent, which we need to have that conversation in society, because I think that these are complicated issues that are not as crisp as they might be in some other legal contexts. And I'll stop there and we can discuss.
The joys of academia is that we can pontificate for hours and hours on end, and we have to actually pull ourselves back from the edge every now and then, otherwise we hear snores. So this is a very complicated issue, and there are many stakeholders, involved in this. This has been an ongoing concern. And we've seen new proposals to deal with it. This morning we had the panel talking about the information sharing, some of the initiatives therein. But yet, if you notice in the hearings that go into the public testimony, much of the folks who are providing testimony are industry and vendor representatives. They're not necessarily security researchers or operational folks. They're representatives of the vendors who will be directly affected by whatever information sharing, vulnerability disclosure practices or laws are put in place. So there's an asymmetry between vendors on one hand and those who are doing vulnerability research and disclosure on the other hand. And we need to find a way to better equalize the level of public discourse so that those who actually have boots on the ground, so to speak, in this discussion are at the table in a meaningful way and not relegated to the third speaking spot on the third panel session on a day of hearings. They need to be up front and center on panel one on C-SPAN with everybody in the room watching them and hearing what they have to say. I would also add that we need to be vigilant. And there are groups, at this conference and in other places and many academics watching what goes into these bills and these proposals to make sure that public interests and public security and privacy and civil liberties are preserved. We have to be vigilant. A lot of this is done through nonprofit NGOs. That's helpful. Okay? We need to make sure that as these bills are promoted and discussed officially, that there's that balance. The big controversial moment in the CISA is that one phrase, notwithstanding any other provision of law. That's terrifying to civil libertarians and others, and I think rightfully so. Okay? If we weren't watching for that, that probably would have snuck through and nobody would have had a second thought about it. So we need to be vigilant about how we're approaching the idea of vulnerability disclosure because how we approach that may then have follow-on consequences far beyond cybersecurity itself, going into privacy concerns, mission creep. What is cybersecurity information? What is vulnerability information? Could that be then extended to include other types of computer-related crimes, intellectual property, monitoring, things like that? Okay, we have to be very diligent, and that requires vigilance. And then finally, before I open it for a quick public discussion here, we have to be mindful about public-private partnerships and what I call the cult of classification. There are a lot of shared technologies in the private sector as well as the government. There is not an exclusively government way of securing the Windows system. Okay? We need to make sure that information is deemed a vulnerability or cybersecurity risk information is not automatically classified and kept out of public view, or people who stumble across it through various legal means are prosecuted one way or the other. Okay. Some stuff needs to be kept secret, absolutely. But there is a heavy-handed shift towards classifying and keeping secret, which then does have a chilling effect on security research and security vulnerability disclosure. In a democratic society, that can be problematic, especially when you start talking to lawyers and you get into First Amendment discussions. So I don't have a clear answer as to how this will be resolved. It surely won't be resolved today. But the panel, we certainly welcome ideas and thoughts to how we might approach looking at this issue. Are there opportunities for discussion that we've missed, that we as an industry have missed? Are there things that we've ignored? And with that, I'd like to open it up. We have a few minutes remaining for any comments, questions, or observations about this situation and what we might be able to do about it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Drew. I work at Access. And I have a question about the government's own vulnerability disclosure policies. We saw recently that the EFF released the Vulnerabilities Equities Process policy document that didn't really go into too much detail, but the federal government has claimed that they released the vast majority of vulnerabilities that they discover, but it's not yet clear really what that means. Like, what are the vulnerabilities that they do keep? What are they using it for? What type of vulnerabilities are those? So I guess I'm wondering, what is the broader impact on the culture of disclosure when the government is having its own lack of transparency and potentially advanced disclosure policy, and then maybe do you have any thoughts on what the government could do policy-wise?
So one of the biggest things I found as somebody who worked in disclosure programs was a very clear, very concise disclosure policy to include what you considered a security bug, what qualified as a correct submission, what you released, how you released it, when you released it. Transparency here is key, particularly in the case of the government, which got, through Snowden, caught with its hand in the cookie jar. They don't have a credible leg to stand on when they say, we've released all the exploits, but please ignore all these releases over here showing ways that we continue to manipulate and exploit. Transparency, audits to go ahead on their end to show that, yes, you know what, we can see that you've received these submissions, you've received these discoveries, whether through private sector, public sector. They have to open up and let people know. It's the same way vendors have to open up and let people know that, hey, yeah, here's how our process works, here's how submissions come up. Because what happens is, otherwise we get things, EII had a great bit where they would show, here are vulnerabilities we've submitted to various vendors, and here's how long it's taken these vendors to respond back. And it wasn't days, it wasn't weeks, it was months to years on how long they would sit and just wait, languish. And yeah, okay, maybe they're not weaponizing it, maybe they're not using it, but they're not doing anything constructive for their public, their constituents with it. And that's, I think, kind of the real answer is, demonstrate to me as a person who's subsidizing your vulnerability disclosure program that you are serving the public interest. And yes, I understand that by helping to patch that, that may help to serve various American enemies, however you want to classify them. But you have to serve me, your constituent, first.
So,
on that notion, I was wondering, I mean, what are the differences and what is similar between whistleblowers and security researchers? I mean, there are some similarities.
That's a question for the lawyer, I think.
Well, so part of the challenge is that different bodies of law treat whistleblowers differently. So it's a great question, and I think it's one that we need to think through as a society about our overall approach to these issues. In the private and public sector, this is one space where arguably there may be slightly different concerns. But you've highlighted one of the key definitional differences across bodies of law in the way that different agencies reward or punish whistleblowers. So, for example, the IRS and the SEC financially reward whistleblowers. Other pieces of the government and private sector entities sometimes definitely don't financially reward. The companies that use bug bounty programs, for example, if you want to view security researchers as a form of whistleblower, then companies with bug bounty programs are financially rewarding. Companies who are issuing legal threats are not financially rewarding. So I think you've highlighted one of those areas where we're lacking a common language and discourse, and it's one of the initial important conversations that we should have in building out a sustainable set of emergent feedback loops for security.
Okay, we got time for one more question here, and I see your hand over there.
I want to ask how you think civil society organizations should approach disclosures if they discover that they've been hacked or if they have a malicious actor within their systems. Should they come clean at the risk of maybe damaging their credibility with their constituents, people who are confiding in them confidentially, or how should they let that play out?
I think a lot of this comes down to questions of perceptions and public trust. And if you are affected, if you're a civil organization, or if you're an organization that is affected by something major, a data breach or something like that, I think you have an obligation. It's that social contract that we were talking about before, to let your constituencies know what's happened. You may not need to be specific, but you need to at least say something happened. You may be. I mean, who here has not received free credit monitoring for at least a year? Okay, we've all received that. Okay, we've all been told we're part of a potential problem. Okay, so I think that's the correct approach. At least it's giving us some information that we as individuals can monitor our own lives and see if we're affected. So I would err on the side of selectively disclosing that there's a problem, but you don't need to come out necessarily in open kimono. I think that's going a bit too far and may well cause problems down the road for your constituents.
So one quick test that I sometimes tell private sector companies, if you were walking up the stairs in someone's house and they had a stair that was going to collapse under your foot, would you want them to warn you? So if the vulnerability is serious enough that it is functionally a severe source of potential harm, then there is likely an ethical, maybe even legal duty to warn people in a way that prevents them from experiencing that harm. So that may not be providing a 6-page technical summary of all of the mitigation maneuvers, but it does involve likely telling people how not to be further injured by interacting with you.
Yeah.
And there are instances where private sector entities have simply taken their sites down with a warning placard. We're working on it. We've been alerted that there is a risk of attackers on our site. To keep you safe, we are down. We'll be back up as soon as we can. I think at this point, everyone who reads the news knows that we are all just doing the best that we can with security issues, and that some types of vulnerabilities are not predictable. So even if you are engaging in reasonable care and doing everything right, you're still sometimes going to get hit out of nowhere. But the question is how you handle it. And the best mitigation is neither to entirely hide it nor to have engineers running down the hall screaming, right? It's having a process in place and to provide at least as much information to help people not be newly injured because they're interacting with you.
One of the one of my professional areas is incident handling. What happens when these incidents occur, and keeping your head is one thing, and keeping your people informed certainly plays a large role in that. A good example is how U.S. CERT used to do advisories. Years prior, in the 80s and 90s, when it was the CERT CC up at Carnegie Mellon, they would put out CERT advisory. Techies, engineers, we'd be involved in these documents, and they were technical. And they were, line and verse about how you would fix the problem. Lay people don't understand that. They need to know, okay, there's a problem in my Windows widget, whatever. I should turn this off, click here, and do that. They don't need to know the low-level technical. So what US CERT did when it was stood up, it created a two-tiered system where the lay people, my mom, would get these alerts, very high-level general and understandable to a mass audience, warning them of a potential problem. And if you were an engineer or a techie or a security person, you could subscribe to the more technical vulnerability alerts from CERT, from US CERT, which would give you that information that you would get, but your Aunt Tilly really wouldn't understand, nor should she care about. But it was a way of making sure that the communication, the message was received by the constituencies based on their level of perception, which kind of ties back to what Andrea was saying about, having the right framework in place so the message gets out in a way that's understandable and meaningful in terms of warning and sharing information. So I know we're coming up on the end of our session here. We'll be around for a few minutes afterwards. I'd like to thank everybody for staying awake and not throwing things at us. And we wish you a pleasant rest of the afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your comment about the advisories and the aggregation, because one of the most painful things I had to do as a director of SecOps was to